The proximity alarm went off at 03:47, and for 4 seconds nobody at Yukon base believed it. Marimo Jinguji had been staring at the same sensor sweep for the better part of an hour, the kind of graveyard shift monotony that made her eyes ache more than any combat alert ever did. Snow static, wind shear readings, the low electromagnetic hum of a beta hive 12 kilometers north that never really slept and never really moved either. Just sat there, patient the way only something without a mind could be patient. She'd learned to read that hum like a heartbeat, steady, familiar, almost comforting. In the ugly way anything constant becomes comforting, when the alternative is the unknown. Then the readout tore, not spiked, tore, the way a sheet of paper tears when you pull it too hard. A jagged discontinuity running clean through 3 separate sensor arrays at once. EM and thermal and gravimetric all screaming different numbers from the same 11-degree arc of sky. Jinguji's coffee went cold in her hand and she didn't notice until the mug tipped and she caught it by reflex. Command, confirm sensor fault on arrays 6 through 9, she said, already knowing it wasn't a fault, because faults didn't have a shape. This did. Something in the data had edges. The response came back 30 seconds later, clipped and unimpressed. Arrays are green. Recalibrating won't clear it. Whatever you're reading is real. Jinguji stood up so fast her chair rolled back into the console behind her. By 03:51 the anomaly had a rough fix. 8 kilometers north-northeast of the base, deep in the tree line above the ridge that separated Yukon's perimeter from the long-dead stretch of taiga everyone just called the Gray Belt, because nothing had grown there in 3 years, and nobody bothered giving it a real name anymore. It sat almost directly between the base and the sleeping hive. That alone was enough to scramble a response. By 03:55, Yui Takamura was in her flight suit and running. The 205th's ready room smelled the way it always did before a scramble. Recycled air gone stale with adrenaline, the metallic tang of coolant lines venting somewhere down the corridor. Somebody's half-finished coffee abandoned on the briefing table. Michael Smith was already strapping into his gear when Yui came through the hatch, and the look on her face told him this wasn't a drill before Jinguji's voice ever hit the intercom. Multiple contact profile, unknown classification, Jinguji's voice said, flattened by the speaker static, but not flattened enough to hide the edge underneath it. Not matching any registered beta signature. Repeat, not matching any known type. Command wants eyes on it before we commit anything larger than a 4-ship flight. Not matching, Kriska Barchanova repeated, from the far bench, already running her fingers along the neural contacts at her temple, in the slow habitual motion she used before every sortie. Checking the interface was seated right. Beside her, Inia sat very still, the way she always did when she was listening harder than she was speaking. That's not usually good news. It's not usually anything, Andrew Rusanov said, pulling his gloves on with the unhurried economy of a man who'd stopped being surprised by anything the front threw at him, roughly 2 years and 40 confirmed kills ago. New beta types show up. It happens. Command panics. We go look. Half the time it's a Fort-class variant somebody forgot to update the recognition manual for. And the other half? Michael asked. Rusanov didn't answer that one. He just checked the seal on his flight suit collar and walked toward the launch bay. 4 TSFs went up into the dark 11 minutes later. Takamura, Smith, Rusanov, and the Esper pair flying tandem support in the Type 00R. Kriska's targeting data threading straight into Inia's fire control, the way it had 100 times before. The Alaskan sky above Yukon base was clear and hard and full of stars, the kind of cold where the air itself felt like it had edges, and the TSF's actuators whined against it as the 4 fighters cleared the ridge in tight formation, thermal exhaust trailing pale against black. Command, 205th is feet dry over the ridge, Takamura said. I have visual on. She stopped. Below them, where the tree line broke into the dead gray stretch of the belt, the ground was moving. Not Beta moving, not the lumbering armored bulk of soldier class or the skittering low-slung profile of a warrior swarm crossing open terrain. The shapes her eye had learned to read faster than conscious thought after 2 years of war. This was something else. Low, fast, wrong in a way that took her brain a half-second longer than it should have to process. Because the shapes weren't metal, and they weren't flesh in any configuration a hive produced. They were segmented, chitinous, moving in loose clusters that broke and reformed like something between insect and animal, throwing up ground fog with each stride, even though nothing on this front generated that particular temperature signature. Command. I need eyes confirming what I'm seeing, Takamura said, voice level through pure discipline. Ground contact, unknown type, estimate 40+ individual units, moving in coordinated. Coordinated, Rusanov repeated sharply, banking his TSF for a better angle. Beta don't coordinate like that, not below hive command tier. They're not Beta, Kriska said. Her voice had changed, gone thin, focused, the particular stillness she got when she was pushing her Esper sense out past its comfortable range. I'm not reading anything, no present signature, nothing. It's like flying over empty ground that happens to have things moving on it. That's not possible, Inia said quietly. Everything has some signature. I know, Kriska said. That's what I'm telling you. The ground contacts hadn't reacted to the TSFs yet. Or if they had, they weren't reacting the way anything on this front reacted to a TSF's approach. No defensive clustering, no attempt to break line of sight, nothing Takamura's instincts, honed against 3 years of Beta engagement patterns, could hang a prediction on. It was Michael who saw the rift first, because he was the only one still looking north instead of down. Takamura. Sky. 12 o'clock high. What is that? She looked up, and her mind did the same half-second stutter it had done at the ground contacts, except worse, because this wasn't ambiguous at all. A tear had opened in the air itself, roughly 600 meters above the tree line, its edges lit sick violet green, pulsing faintly like something breathing, and through it, she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe this moment to people who hadn't seen it and never quite managing. Through it, more of the segmented shapes were arriving, spilling out of a hole in the sky the way water spills over a lip, and beyond the tear, for one impossible half-second before her mind refused to hold the image any longer, she thought she saw something vast and dark on the other side, something with too many shapes moving inside it at once. Command, be advised, she said, and her voice, for the first time in longer than she could remember, was not entirely steady. I need you to confirm long-range imaging on this, because I don't believe what I'm looking at. There's an aperture, a rupture, in the sky, north of our position, and hostile contacts are transiting through it in real time. Silence on the comm for 3 full seconds, an eternity, in flight terms, while Jinguji's team scrambled to redirect every optical asset the base had at the coordinates Takamura fed them. 205th. Command copies. We have confirmation. Repeat. We have confirmation. Imaging is. Jinguji's voice cracked, just slightly, just once. The only time in 3 years Takamura had heard it do that. All units. This is not a known phenomenon. Command has no doctrine for this. Maintain distance. Do not engage, unless engaged. I say again, do not engage. The order came 4 seconds too late. Something below broke from the loose swarm cluster and launched itself skyward, with a speed that shouldn't have been physically available to something that size. Not a leap. Closer to controlled detonation. Chitin wings unfolding mid-air, with a sound like cracking ice, and it closed the 400 meters to Michael's TSF, faster than his threat warning system finished processing the contact as hostile. Break, break, break! Rusanov was already shouting when the thing hit. It didn't hit with the blunt, grinding force of a beta impact. It hit precisely. 3 curved talons finding the seam between Michael's TSF's shoulder plating and the actuator housing beneath. And for one horrifying second, the machine's proximity alarm screamed a hull breach warning before Michael wrenched the frame sideways hard enough to throw the creature clear, venting atmosphere from a gash that hadn't been there a heartbeat ago. I'm hit. Hull integrity at, Christ, it's already sealing. The wound is sealing itself. Takamura didn't wait for command to finish arguing with itself over doctrine that didn't exist yet. She rolled her TSF into a dive, cannon tracking, and put 3 rounds of 232mm smoothbore fire directly into the creature as it fell back from Michael's frame. Solid hits. She watched them land, watched chitin crack and dark fluid spray black against the snow far below. It didn't die. It hit the ground in a controlled tumble, rolled once, and was back on its feet before she'd finished her pass. 3 long gouges across its carapace, already closing at a rate that made her stomach drop. Command, be advised, conventional ordnance is not achieving kill confirmation, she said. Repeat, hits are not lethal. These things regenerate in real time. Copy, 205th. Be advised. Beta main force elements are stirring at the hive site, Jinguji said. And now there was something close to panic threading under the professionalism. I say again, the hive 12 clicks north has gone active. Full hive scale movement. This is not a drill. This is not related to your original tasking. We have 2 separate hostile force generations converging on the same sector simultaneously. They're not converging, Kriska said suddenly, sharp. They're colliding. Look, she was right. Through the tree line, the first true beta elements were emerging from the hive's northern approach. Soldier class in a loose vanguard formation, the specific lumbering gait Takamura had watched 1,000 times in 1,000 engagements, and the alien swarm cluster that had come through the rift was not falling back from them, was not scattering the way any sane force would from a hive-scale mobilization. It was turning to meet them. For one suspended, unbearable moment, all 4 TSF pilots hung in the freezing dark and watched 2 extinction-grade threats close on each other across the dead ground of the Grey Belt, and none of them, not Takamura with her 3 years of frontline instinct, not Rusanov with his cold veteran's math, not even Kriska with her Esper sense straining against a wall of nothing, had the faintest idea what was about to happen, or which outcome would be worse. Command, Takamura said quietly. I need orders, because I don't think we get to sit this one out. The silence that answered her lasted 4 full seconds, and in the freezing dark above the Grey Belt, the first true clash between the swarm and the hive began, without waiting for anyone's permission at all. A wet, tearing violence of chitin against biomechanical flesh, a sound like a landslide made of teeth, and somewhere above it, unnoticed by every sensor still fixed on the ground battle, the rift in the sky pulsed once, brighter, and did not close. Marimo Jinguji stood over the command table with both hands flat against its edge, staring at a tactical display that had, in the space of 11 minutes, stopped making any kind of sense. Get me direct command on a secure line, she said, not looking up. Tell them Yukon base has a contact situation that doesn't fit any threat classification in the database. Tell them we need doctrine, and we need it before sunrise, because right now I have 2 separate extinction-level forces fighting each other 4 kilometers from my perimeter fence, and I do not know if that is the best news this war has ever had, or the worst. Nobody answered her, because nobody in the room had an answer either. On the main display, the sensor return from the Grey Belt had degraded into a churning mess of contact icons overlapping so densely the system had stopped trying to individually track them, defaulting instead to a single flashing designation that made the hair on the back of Jinguji's neck rise every time her eyes crossed it. Multiple unknown hostiles. Engagement in progress. Origin uncertain. Above the battlefield, unseen by any TSF still circling at a wary distance, unseen by any satellite still recalibrating against the sensor tear that had started all of this, the rift widened another 2 meters, and something vast began, very slowly, to move toward it from the other side. Yuko Kozuki had been asleep for exactly 40 minutes when they woke her, and she came into the analysis lab still fastening the collar of her lab coat, hair pulled back in the same rushed knot she'd used every emergency call for the last 2 years. "Show me," she said, before anyone had finished briefing her, because she'd learned that people summarized badly under pressure, and she trusted the raw feed more than she trusted anyone's panicked shorthand. They showed her. The footage from the ridge-mounted optical array ran in grainy monochrome, time-stamped, 20 minutes old, and already looping on every screen in the analysis wing. The tear in the sky, pulsing with that sick violet-green light, the ground battle churning beneath it, a mess of chitin and biomechanical beta flesh, locked together in violence too chaotic for the tracking software to parse into discrete engagement vectors. Yuko watched it twice through without speaking, arms folded, jaw tight. "The beta aren't retreating," she said finally. "Look at troop commitment. They're not falling back to defensible lines. They're not consolidating around the hive. They're throwing everything at this like it's a direct existential threat to the hive itself." "Which would mean," said the analyst beside her, a thin, nervous man named Petrov, who'd transferred in from the Sedogashima research wing 8 months ago and still hadn't fully adjusted to how casually people at Yukon discussed the end of the world, that the hive's command structure recognizes these, whatever they are, as a threat on the same order as a human offensive. "Maybe worse, or the same order as another hive," Yuko said quietly. That silenced the room for a moment. "You think this is territorial," Petrov said. "I think," Yuko said, "that we're watching 2 things that both eat worlds for a living, find out there's only one world here, and neither one is inclined to share it." She pulled up a still frame, one of the segmented creatures mid-leap, wings unfolded, talons extended toward a soldier-class beta's throat joint, and stared at it the way she stared at every piece of alien anatomy that came across her desk, cataloging rather than fearing, because fear was a luxury the alternative program had never been able to afford its people. "Look at the wound patterns on the beta carcasses, precise, surgical almost. They're not overwhelming through mass the way beta overwhelm us. They're better at this than the thing we've spent 3 years failing to beat." Nobody in the room wanted to sit with that thought for very long. By 0430, Direct Command had woken up 4 separate national liaisons, and none of them agreed on anything. The secure conference feed patched in representatives from the UN Alternative Oversight Committee, a clipped voice from Sedogashima's own command structure demanding immediate data sharing rights on the new contact type, and, least welcome of all, as far as Jinguji was concerned, a liaison from a joint U.S.-European Tactical Assessment Office, whose first question wasn't about troop safety at all. Before anything else, the liaison said, a man named Whitfield whose voice carried the particular flatness of someone used to being the calmest person in every room he entered, "I need confirmation that whatever's happening out there is being fully documented. Every engagement, every casualty pattern on both sides. This is the first genuinely novel threat variable this war has produced in years, and if there's any possibility of leveraging it, Jinguji repeated. "You have 2 forces destroying each other on your perimeter," Whitfield said. "One of them is the enemy we already know we're losing to. I would be doing my job badly if I didn't ask whether the other one represents an opportunity. It also killed a man's arm off in real time and grew it back in under 10 seconds. Rusinov cut in over the comm, still in his cockpit on standby rotation above the ridge, voice tight with the particular fury of someone who'd watched Michael's TSF get clawed open 40 minutes ago and hadn't fully come down from it. "That's not an asset." That's a second extinction event that happens to be busy right now. Noted, Whitfield said, entirely unbothered, and Jinguji found herself disliking him with an intensity that surprised her, because she'd met men like him before. Men for whom the war was a resource allocation problem first, and a horror only in the abstract, filed somewhere behind the spreadsheet. Command priority, Jinguji said, cutting through before it went further, is base security and pilot safety. Whatever policy conversation happens above my rank. Right now the situation on the ground has not stabilized, and I need a decision on whether the 205th holds position, withdraws, or receives authorization to engage whichever side survives the current clash. Because one of them is going to. The line went quiet for a moment. It was the Sadogashima liaison who spoke next, a woman named Reika whose voice Jinguji had heard on maybe 6 calls in 2 years, and never once with this particular strain in it. Recommend full withdrawal of the 205th to defensive perimeter and immediate deployment of long-range artillery, pre-sighted on the rift coordinates. If that aperture is a sustained transit point, closing troop movement through it becomes the priority over identifying what's coming through. You want to shell an unexplained phenomenon in the sky, Whitfield said. I want to close the door before we find out how big the room on the other side is, Rika said. Jinguji, listening to 2 command philosophies collide as badly as the forces above her base, found she had no strong instinct toward either one, and hated that most of all. Above the gray belt, the battle had not ended. It had simply changed shape. Takamura held her TSF at a wary standoff distance, cannon still tracking, watching through her scope as the engagement below entered what she could only describe, later, in the debrief, struggling for language that didn't sound insane, as a second phase. The initial beta vanguard was gone, torn apart in the first 8 minutes with a thoroughness that unsettled her more than any single beta engagement she'd flown. But the hive hadn't stopped committing forces. More soldier class were emerging from the tree line now, and behind them, worse, the heavier profile of a fort class, main gun already tracking, the ground shuddering under its approach even at this distance. The swarm creatures reorganized to meet it with a coordination that made Kriska go rigid in her cockpit 200 meters off Takamura's wing. Something's directing them, Kriska said. Not from inside the individual units. I still can't read them. It's like trying to sense a hole in the air. But there's a pattern to how they're moving now that wasn't there 10 minutes ago. Something changed the coordination the moment the fort class engaged. Command decision. Mid-battle, Rusinov said grimly. That takes a directing intelligence. Something with actual command authority, not just instinct. Beta don't have that below hive mind tier, Michael said, voice still strained. He'd been ordered to hold at the rear formation after the hull breach, and Takamura could hear how much he hated it. So either this is a distributed intelligence acting through every unit at once, or there's something on that ground giving orders, Takamura finished. Command, I want authorization to get a visual confirmation on any command tier individual among the unknown hostiles. If there's a leadership element, I want eyes on it before direct command decides whether we're diplomatically relevant to whatever's happening down there. The pause before Jinguji answered was long enough that Takamura knew the answer was being argued somewhere above her pay grade before it reached her. 205th. You are authorized for close visual reconnaissance only. Do not engage. Repeat. Observation only. Maintain maximum standoff distance consistent with maintaining visual. Takamura brought her TSF down through 600 meters of freezing dark. Thermal plume trailing pale against black sky, weapons hot but holstered, every instinct in her body screaming that this was the kind of caution that got pilots killed on a front that had never once rewarded hesitation. She leveled off at 200 meters and swept her scope across the churning battlefield below. She found it near the center of the fighting, where the ground was worst torn, A single figure, humanoid in silhouette but wrong in every particular, tall and pale beneath armor plating that looked grown rather than built, wings of dark chitin folded along its back, standing in the middle of a killing field, with the specific, terrible stillness of something that had never once needed to run from anything in its existence. As Takamura watched, it raised one clawed hand, and 80 meters away a cluster of the swarm creatures broke from their current engagement and redirected as one, flowing toward a flanking beta element with a precision that had nothing instinctive about it at all. "Command," Takamura said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I have a visual on what I believe is a command-tier individual among the hostiles. It's—" She stopped, hunting for words that wouldn't sound like she'd lost her nerve. "It's directing the battle personally, in real time, on the ground." And it just looked up. Through her scope, across 200 meters of freezing dark and a battlefield littered with the dead of two different worlds, the figure's head had turned, and though there was no possible way it could have seen her cockpit at this range through smoke and dark, Takamura would swear, for the rest of her life, in every retelling, that for one full second it looked directly at her. Then it turned back to the fight, unhurried, and struck the Fort-class Beta's forward sensor cluster with a bolt of raw violet energy that arced from its raised hand like something between lightning and a scream, and the Fort-class staggered, its main gun swinging wide, its armored hull screaming under a kind of damage Takamura had never once seen conventional weapons produce. "Command," she said. "Belay my last. I don't think observation is going to hold much longer. I think whatever that is knows exactly what it's doing, and I don't think it's finished." Behind her, on the standby line, Michael's voice came through tight with something that wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite awe either. "Takamura, if that thing wins down there, what happens when it looks at us next?" Nobody answered him, because above the gray belt, in the freezing dark, the Fort-class Beta let out a groaning mechanical shriek, and finally, after everything it had survived on this front for 3 years, began, for the first time any of them had ever witnessed, to fall. And half a kilometer above the wreckage, the rift in the sky pulsed once more, wider, and something new began to come through. The Fort-class Beta took 4 minutes to die, and Takamura had never once, in 3 years on this front, watched anything take that long and still call it dying, because Fort-class units didn't die slowly. They were built to absorb punishment on a scale that made slow death a contradiction. Armor plating rated to survive saturation artillery fire, a mass distribution that made catastrophic failure a statistical rarity, even against coordinated TSF strike packages. She had seen Fort-class units limp away from engagements that should have killed anything. She had never seen one come apart like this, joint by joint, plating peeling back under repeated strikes from the violet energy the pale figure kept lashing out with. Its main gun finally silenced not by destruction of the weapon itself, but by the destruction of whatever coordinated its firing solution, until the whole vast biomechanical bulk of it folded sideways into the snow, with a sound like a collapsing building, and did not move again. The swarm creatures didn't celebrate. They didn't do anything Takamura would have called celebration, at least. No triumphant posturing, no pause to regroup. They simply reoriented, as one, toward the next beta formation still pressing out of the tree line, and kept killing with the same terrible economy they'd shown from the first engagement. "Command, Fort-class element is down," Takamura reported, and heard her own voice come out flatter than she meant it to. Professional distance the only thing keeping the raw wrongness of what she'd just watched from bleeding through. "I say again, confirmed kill on Fort-class Beta by unknown hostile force. This is the first Fort-class kill I have personally witnessed that did not require a coordinated multi-unit strike package." The silence on the command channel this time was different from every silence before it. Longer, heavier. "Copy. 205th. Jinguji said finally. And even through the calm static, Takamura could hear something in her voice had shifted. Not panic exactly. Something colder and more clear-eyed. The sound of someone recalculating every assumption they'd built their career on. Maintain standoff position. Command is convening at direct command level. Stand by. In the secure conference room 3 floors beneath Yukon Base's surface. The argument that had been simmering since 0430 finally boiled over. You watched what that thing just did to a fort class, Rika said, her voice carrying clean and hard across the feed from Sadogashima. I don't care what political value anyone thinks they see in this. We have pre-sighted artillery on the rift coordinates. I am requesting immediate authorization to fire. On what basis? Whitfield's voice came back, still maddeningly level. You want to close a phenomenon we don't understand, potentially trapping an active combat variable on our side of it that has just demonstrated capability against our primary existential threat that no human weapon system has achieved in 3 years of war. That's not caution, Colonel. That's throwing away the first real advantage this war has produced. It's not an advantage, Rika snapped. It's an unknown. You do not know what that thing wants. You do not know if it stops with Beta. For all we know, it considers us the same category of prey. Then we find out under controlled conditions rather than guessing from a command bunker, Whitfield said. Jinguji, patched in from Yukon, listened to 2 senior officers argue policy over a battlefield she could see with her own eyes on the tactical display, and felt something in her chest go very tight and very cold. With respect to both of you, she said, I have pilots holding position 4 kilometers from an active engagement between the 2 most dangerous forces either of you has ever discussed in the abstract, and right now nobody is talking about them. If direct command authorizes an artillery strike on that rift, it happens with full awareness that the 205th is currently operating inside potential blast radius of both the target and whatever secondary effects an aperture of unknown physical nature produces when struck by conventional ordnance. That, finally, silenced the room. Understood, said a new voice. General Katsuhito Chidorigafuchi, Direct Command's senior liaison for the Alaska Theater, patched in from somewhere further up the chain than anyone in the room had direct contact with. Takamura had spoken to him exactly twice in her career, both times at ceremonies, never once in an operational context. His presence on the line now told her, more than anything else said so far, how seriously this was being taken above her level. Colonel Whitfield's position and Colonel Reika's position are not, at this moment, mutually exclusive. We will not fire on the rift while human assets remain within probable effect radius. That is not negotiable. Withdraw the 205th to a minimum safe distance, and reassess artillery authorization once they are clear. General, Whitfield started, if we withdraw observation assets, we lose the ability to track. Then we lose it, Chidorigafuchi said, with a flatness that ended the conversation. I did not reach this rank by spending pilots to satisfy curiosity. Colonel Reika, prepare firing solutions but hold for confirmed 205th withdrawal. Base Command Jinguji, order your squadron clear. Jinguji exhaled something that wasn't quite relief. Copy, General. 205th, this is command. Withdraw to 5 kilometers. Minimum safe distance for pending artillery action. Say again. Withdraw immediately. Takamura had flown 3 years of engagements without once feeling reluctant to break contact. Retreat, when ordered, was simply another tactical position, and she'd learned early that the pilots who survived longest were the ones who didn't let pride override a withdrawal order. But something about pulling back now, with the battle below still raging, with that pale figure still moving through the wreckage of a fort class it had killed with its bare hands, sat wrong in a way she couldn't immediately name. Command, copy withdrawal order, she said anyway, because orders were orders, and began bringing her TSF around. That was when Kriska's voice cut through the channel, sharp with something close to alarm. Wait, something's changed. I'm actually reading something now. It wasn't there before and now it's everywhere, all at once, like a light switching on across the whole battlefield. Reading what? Rusinov demanded. Presence, Kriska said. Not from the individual creatures. I think from the one directing them. It's not blind to us anymore. I think it just noticed we've been watching it this whole time, and it's... She stopped. It's curious. That's the closest thing I can call it. Not hostile. Not yet. Curious. Below them, the pale figure had gone still amid the wreckage, chitin wings half unfurled, and for the second time that night, Takamura had the deeply unsettling sensation of being looked at across a distance that shouldn't have permitted it. Then, without any warning telegraphed by posture or movement, the figure's wings snapped fully open, and it launched itself skyward, not toward the retreating TSFs, not in obvious aggression, but on a trajectory that would bring it to a hovering position roughly 300 meters from Takamura's flight path, close enough to be seen clearly, far enough to not immediately read as an attack run. Command, be advised, hostile command tier individual is closing on our position, Takamura said, voice tight, weapons already coming back online despite the withdrawal order. It does not appear to be, she hesitated, hunting for the honest word. It does not appear to be attacking. It appears to be approaching. Takamura, withdraw, Jinguji's voice snapped over the comm. That is a direct order. Do not engage. Do not allow proximity. Copy. Attempting withdrawal, Takamura said, already banking her TSF hard away, throttle at maximum, and found, with a chill that ran deeper than the Alaskan cold outside her cockpit, that the figure matched her vector effortlessly, closing the distance at a pace that made clear it could close the rest whenever it chose to. It stopped at what felt, with horrible precision, like exactly the range at which a human might choose to stop, before another human they didn't yet consider a threat. Hovering there in the freezing dark, wings beating slow and silent, violet eyes fixed on Takamura's cockpit with an intelligence that made every instinct she'd built over 3 years of beta warfare useless, because nothing about this read as animal, and nothing about it read as machine either. For 3 full seconds, nobody on either side of that gap moved. Then the figure, queen of a swarm that had just annihilated a Fort-class beta with less apparent effort than Takamura's squadron spent on a single soldier class, tilted its head, very slightly, in a gesture that was unmistakably, unnervingly human, and Takamura would swear afterward that she heard something, not through her comm, not through any conventional channel at all, but directly and coldly inside her own skull. 3 words that carried no warmth and no threat either, only the flat certainty of something that had never once needed to lie to get what it wanted. You're not beta. Command, Takamura said, and her voice, for the first time that night, shook. I need everyone to understand that I just heard something that did not come through my radio. Below and behind her, the artillery batteries at Setogashima finished their firing solution calculations and sat, waiting on a fire order that General Chidori Fuchi had not yet given, while 300 meters from Takamura's cockpit, in the freezing Alaskan dark, the Queen of Blades studied the first human pilot she had ever encountered, with an expression that held no mercy in it, but no immediate hunger either, only the terrible, patient calculation of something deciding, in real time, exactly how useful this new world's inhabitants might turn out to be. Takamura did not fire. It was not obedience to Jinguji's earlier order. That order had asked for withdrawal, not restraint under active telepathic contact, and there was no doctrine on record for what she was experiencing now. It was something closer to instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 3 years of a war that punished hesitation, as often as it punished recklessness. The understanding, arriving somewhere beneath conscious thought, that firing on something that had just spoken inside her own skull, without so much as raising a weapon toward her, would answer a question she badly needed answered first. "I heard you," she thought back, deliberately, not certain the thought would carry any further than her own cockpit, not certain this wasn't simply the fraying edge of adrenaline and exhaustion producing an auditory hallucination dressed up as contact. "If you understand me, I need to know what you want." The figure, Kerrigan, though Takamura had no way yet of knowing the name that would eventually attach itself to that face in every debrief that followed, tilted her head again, wings beating a slow, unhurried rhythm against the cold air, and the answer that came back was not words exactly, more an impression translated into words by whatever was doing the translating, cold and utterly without performance. "What I always want. Ground, resources, things that grow." A pause, and something in the quality of the silence that followed felt, absurdly, like amusement. "This world already has something eating it. That's inconvenient. I don't share hunting grounds." "Command," Takamura said aloud, voice tight, relaying what she could of an exchange she barely trusted herself. "The hostile individual is communicating directly. It states intent to compete with Beta for territory. It does not currently express hostile intent toward human forces specifically." "Currently," Rusinov repeated over the comm, from his holding position 400 meters back. "That's not the same as won't." "No," Takamura agreed. "It's not." Below, at direct command, General Chidori Fuchi's voice cut through the channel with the particular weight of someone who had just been handed a decision no doctrine had prepared him to make. "Takamura, ask it directly. Does it consider human forces a threat, an obstacle, or irrelevant?" Takamura relayed the question, feeling faintly absurd doing so. A TSF pilot conducting a diplomatic exchange with something that had just torn a fort class apart with its bare hands, 300 meters from her cockpit. The answer, when it came, carried an edge Takamura hadn't felt in the first exchange. Something colder, more considering. "You're small. You're fragile. You've been losing this fight for years. I can feel that in how you fly. The way every one of you compensates for weapons you know aren't enough. Whether you're a threat depends entirely on whether you get in my way. Whether you're an obstacle depends on whether the thing you're already losing to gets in line first. Right now, we have the same enemy. That's not friendship. It's math. It says we have a shared enemy for now," Takamura reported, translating as faithfully as she could manage. "It characterizes our relationship as circumstantial, not adversarial, contingent on whether either side interferes with the other's objectives against the Beta." The silence on the command channel this time lasted long enough that Takamura began to wonder if the line had dropped. "That is either the best strategic opening this war has ever been handed," Chidori Fuchi said finally, "or the most dangerous. Takamura, disengage from contact. Return to base. We are not making policy decisions over an open comm channel at 3 in the morning, based on second-hand telepathy." "Copy, Command," Takamura said, and began very carefully to withdraw. No sudden vector change this time, nothing that might read as fleeing, simply a slow, deliberate retreat that left the choice of pursuit entirely with the thing hovering in the dark behind her. It did not follow. She caught, in her rear optic feed, one last image, before distance and darkness swallowed it. Kerrigan turning away, wings folding, dropping back down toward the wreckage of the fort class, and the ongoing carnage of a battlefield that was, by every metric available to human sensors, still very much unfinished. By the time the 205th cleared the 5-kilometer minimum safe radius, direct command had reached, at long last, an actual decision, though not one that satisfied Rika, Whitfield, or, Jinguji suspected privately, anyone at all. "Hold artillery," Chidori Fuchi ordered. The rift remains open. Hostile forces continue to engage Beta main force elements at the original contact site, and human assets are now clear of probable effect radius. We will not act against a phenomenon we don't understand while it is, by every available metric, currently degrading our primary strategic threat. We observe. We do not engage unless engaged. We gather every scrap of data this produces, and we reconvene at 900 with the full weight of what analysis can tell us. General, Whitfield said, and Jinguji could hear, even through the flat professionalism, something almost triumphant in his voice. I want it on record that I recommend immediate research prioritization on any recoverable biological or technological samples this engagement produces. If that entity's capability against Fort-class Beta can be studied, replicated, weaponized even partially. It's on record, Chidori Fuchi said, in a tone that made clear he found the eagerness distasteful even while permitting it. Colonel Reika, your objection? Stands, Rika said flatly. For the record also, I don't think we should be looking at what just happened to that Fort class and asking how do we get some of that. I think we should be asking what happens the day it decides it doesn't need a shared enemy anymore. Both positions are noted, Chidori Fuchi said. Base Command Jinguji, secure your perimeter, debrief the 205th, and get me a full account of the contact exchange while it's fresh. We reconvene at 0900. The channel went dead, and Jinguji found herself alone in the command room with Petrov and two junior analysts, all three of them staring at a tactical display that still showed, 4 kilometers north, an ongoing engagement between the two most dangerous forces any of them had ever heard of, framed now not as a threat to be contained but as an opportunity to be studied, and felt, with a clarity she wasn't sure she wanted, that Reika's fear was the one she trusted more than Whitfield's ambition. The debrief. When Takamura and her squadron finally landed and stripped out of their flight suits in the freezing pre-dawn dark, did not go smoothly. You made contact, Jinguji said. Not quite an accusation, not quite anything else either. The specific flat exhaustion of someone who had been awake for 6 hours, dealing with a crisis nobody had trained her to handle. You were ordered to withdraw, and you engaged in direct communication with a hostile command-tier entity. It engaged with me, Takamura said. I didn't have the option to refuse contact once it initiated. What I had was the option of firing on something that hadn't attacked, based on nothing but the fact that it made me uncomfortable, or listening to what it wanted. She met Jinguji's eyes steadily. I chose to listen. I'd choose it again. That's not a criticism of your judgment in the moment, Jinguji said, softening slightly. It's a question of what we do with what you learned, because direct command is already fracturing over it, and you're the only asset we have who's actually spoken to this thing. Across the room, Kriska sat very still, hands folded in her lap, the particular stillness she got when something was still working itself out behind her eyes. It's not stupid, she said quietly. Whatever else it is. I felt the shape of its thinking for just a moment. When it was speaking to Takamura, it wasn't posturing. It wasn't performing strength the way Beta doesn't need to perform anything, because it doesn't think in those terms at all. This thing was calculating, the whole time, even while it was being, I don't know what to call it, almost gracious. Calculating what? Rusanov asked. Whether we were worth the trouble of killing yet, Kriska said, and the room went very quiet. At 0512, as the first gray edge of dawn began bleeding into the eastern sky over the gray belt, the sensor feeds monitoring the battlefield recorded something that would dominate the 0900 briefing more thoroughly than anything discussed in the hours before it. The last Beta element in the immediate contact zone, a straggling soldier-class formation attempting a fighting withdrawal back toward the hive, was run down and eliminated with the same terrible efficiency that had characterized every engagement since the Fort-class kill. And then the swarm did not pursue toward the hive itself. It stopped. Every creature on that torn, blood and ichor-soaked stretch of ground went still at once, in the same instant, with the same eerie unity that had characterized their coordination throughout the battle, and began, with methodical, unhurried purpose, to consolidate around the rift itself, clearing debris, dragging beta carcasses into piles that the analysts watching the feed would later determine, with mounting horror, were being processed rather than simply discarded. "They're not pushing the advantage," Petrov said, staring at the screen. "They just won a battle against the strongest thing this hive's thrown at anyone in months, and instead of pressing toward the hive itself, they're building something." Yuko Kozuki, who had not left the analysis lab in over an hour, leaned in close to the feed, studying the methodical clearing operation with an expression that mingled professional fascination with something closer to dread. "They're establishing a beachhead," she said quietly. "Not a raiding party. Not an isolated incursion." She looked up at Petrov, and for the first time that night, her composure cracked, just slightly. Whatever came through that rift isn't planning to leave. It's planning to stay. Above the gray belt, in the pale gray light of an Alaskan dawn, the rift pulsed once more, and did not shrink. It grew. The 0900 briefing ran 2 hours late, which told Jinguji more about the state of Direct Command's nerves than anything said once it finally began. She stood at the head of the secure conference room in a uniform she hadn't slept in but wore like she had, flanked by Yuko on one side and Takamura on the other. 3 separate monitor feeds patched in from Sadogashima, from the Joint Tactical Assessment Office, and from a 4th line whose originating location wasn't disclosed to her at all. A courtesy, she understood without being told. That meant whoever was on it outranked everyone else in the conversation by a significant margin. "I'll start with what we know," Jinguji said, "and then I'll tell you what we don't, because right now the second list is considerably longer." She ran through it clean and clipped. The rift, the initial contact, the destruction of a Fort-class beta, in a manner no human weapons system had ever achieved, the direct telepathic exchange with the command-tier entity. She used Takamura's own careful phrasing. The entity, because nobody in the room yet had a name for it, and Jinguji distrusted premature familiarity with something this dangerous, and the overnight consolidation around the rift site that Yuko's team had spent 6 hours analyzing without arriving at a conclusion, better than they are building something and we don't know what. "Ground truth from the overnight satellite pass," Yuko said, pulling up the imaging herself. "This is the contact site as of 0430, and this," she toggled to a second frame, "is the same site as of 0815, less than 4 hours later." The room went quiet. Where the gray belt had been dead gray scrub and old ash for 3 years, a visible discoloration had begun spreading outward from the rift's landing point. A mottled purple-black texture creeping across the ground in slow, deliberate expansion, already covering an area Yuko estimated at close to 800 meters in diameter and growing. "What is that?" Whitfield asked, and for the first time since Jinguji had been dealing with him, his voice carried something other than calculated interest. "We don't know yet," Yuko said. "Structurally, it reads almost like a biological substrate. Texture consistent with organic growth, but composition, unlike anything in our reference database, human or beta. Preliminary thermal analysis suggests it's actively metabolizing something from the ground beneath it. If I had to guess based on limited data, I'd call it infrastructure, not a byproduct of the battle, a deliberate installation." "Infrastructure for what?" Rika asked. "I don't know," Yuko admitted. "But given the timeline, active spread beginning almost immediately after the engagement concluded, no pause for consolidation of forces first, no defensive posture before construction began. I'd say whatever this is, it isn't reacting to us." It's simply proceeding with something it already intended to do the moment it had ground to do it on. Colonization, Rika said flatly. That's the word you're avoiding. It's colonizing. Nobody contradicted her. How fast is the growth rate? The disclosed location voice asked. Flat, unhurried, the calm of someone used to receiving bad news without flinching at it. At current rate, if unchecked, we estimate full coverage of the Grey Belt corridor within 4 to 6 days, Yuko said. After that, expansion toward either the Hive's northern approach or Yukon base's own perimeter becomes a matter of which direction it prioritizes, and we have no data yet on what determines that. Then we have 4 to 6 days to decide what we're doing about it, the voice said, and I'd rather not spend 3 of them arguing in a conference room. The argument happened anyway, because it had to. Whitfield pressing, again, for a joint research and containment initiative that would treat the Rift site as equal parts threat and opportunity, proposing forward observation teams and, delicately but unmistakably, sample recovery from any recoverable remains the engagement had produced. Rika countering with a hard perimeter denial strategy. Artillery interdiction on the expanding creep the moment human assets were clear. Treat it exactly the way protocol treated an emergent hive, and burn it before it could establish itself, the way every hive in this war had once, decades ago, established itself from far less. Jinguji found herself, for the second time in 12 hours, holding a position closer to Reika's than she was entirely comfortable with, and said so plainly when asked. I don't think this is a resource to be leveraged, she said. I think Colonel Reika is right that we don't know what happens the day this thing stops needing a shared enemy. But I also don't think artillery denial is straightforward either, because we watched it kill a fort class with less effort than my squadron spends on a soldier class formation, and I'm not confident conventional ordnance does more against an established position than it did against the individual creatures in the field last night. Then what's your recommendation? The disclosed voice asked. Limited, deniable reconnaissance, Jinguji said. Not a research initiative, not containment, information. We need to know what that infrastructure actually is, whether the entity's stated position, shared enemy, contingent non-hostility, holds up under any kind of pressure, and whether the Beta Hive is going to mount a real counteroffensive, or whether last night's engagement broke something in its command structure that we can exploit separately. I don't want us making an irreversible decision on 4 hours of satellite imaging. There was a pause on the line, and then, unexpectedly, agreement. Not because anyone in the room had changed their underlying position, Jinguji suspected, but because a delay that let each faction keep arguing its case was, in the peculiar logic of committee warfare, more palatable to everyone than an immediate commitment to either extreme. Approved, the voice said. Limited reconnaissance, no engagement, 48-hour window before we reconvene with a firm recommendation. Base Command Jinguji, your squadron flies it. And General, a pause, addressed to Chidori Gafuchi. I want a parallel channel opened with Sadogashima on hive activity patterns since last night's engagement. If that hive took a real structural loss, I want to know whether it's stronger or weaker for us in the next contact. The line went dead, and the room exhaled as one. Michael Smith found Takamura in the equipment bay 2 hours later, running a diagnostic on her TSF's shoulder actuator, with the kind of methodical, unnecessary thoroughness that told him she wasn't actually thinking about the actuator at all. You've run that check 3 times, he said. 4th, Takamura said, not looking up. I keep finding reasons to run it again. He leaned against the gantry railing, watching her work, the recycled air of the bay carrying the same stale coolant smell it always did, comfortingly ordinary against everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. How does it feel? He asked. Hearing something in your head that isn't yours. Takamura's hand stilled on the diagnostic panel for a moment before resuming. Cold, she said finally. Not threatening exactly. Just indifferent to whether I found it threatening. Like being appraised by something that had already decided the appraisal wouldn't take very long. She closed the access panel with more force than the task required. Kriska said it was calculating. She's right, but I don't think it was calculating whether to kill me. I think it was calculating whether I was worth the effort of remembering. That's not better. No, Takamura agreed. It's not. Michael was quiet for a moment. My hull breached in 4 seconds, he said finally, quieter than before. I've taken hits from soldier class before. Fort class, once, glancing. I know what that feels like. The frame groans. You get warning lights. You have time to think. This didn't give me time to think. It just opened me up like the armor plating was decoration. He looked down at his hands. I keep running the sequence back and I still don't understand how it moved that fast. None of us do, Takamura said. That's what scares me more than the entity itself, honestly. Not that it's strong, that we don't have a working model yet for how strong. Every threat on this front, I've learned its shape eventually. Fort class, destroyer class, even the hive itself, in the abstract. I know what Beta can do because I've watched it do everything it can do, over and over, for 3 years, until the shape of the danger stopped being a mystery and became just a math problem. She met his eyes. This isn't a math problem yet. And Command wants to send us back out to gather the numbers for one. The reconnaissance flight went up at 1400. 4 TSFs in loose formation under gray Alaskan daylight, and this time the ground below them told its own story, before anyone reached engagement range. The gray belt had changed again in the 6 hours since the last imaging pass. The purple-black creep had spread further, and rising from it now, visible even at altitude, were structures Yuko's team had no reference point for at all. Low, ridged formations that looked grown rather than built, clustered around the rift's landing point like something between a hive and a wound. And moving among them, visible even from this distance, the unmistakable silhouettes of the swarm creatures, going about tasks that had nothing to do with combat. Ferrying material, tending the ground, doing the slow, patient work of establishment that Reika had named correctly, hours before anyone wanted to admit she was right. Command. Be advised, Takamura said, holding her TSF at careful standoff distance. Structural development is significantly advanced from this morning's imaging. I count at least 6 distinct formations consistent with permanent installation. This isn't a battle site anymore. It's a settlement. Below, near the largest of the new formations, a familiar pale figure stood motionless, wings folded, apparently unbothered by the TSF's approach. And this time, when Kerrigan's head turned toward Takamura's position, the contact that followed carried none of the previous night's careful diplomatic distance at all. Back again, the voice said inside Takamura's skull, flat and almost bored. Tell your commanders they have less time than they think to decide what they want from me, because I've already decided what I want from you. Command, Takamura said, throat tight. I have renewed contact. It states we have less time than we believe to determine our position toward it. She hesitated, and that it has already determined its position toward us. The silence on the comm this time was the longest yet, and somewhere behind the reconnaissance flight, 4 to 6 days shrank, in the space of that single sentence, into something that felt very much smaller. I want a name for what you're offering before I decide anything, Takamura sent back, deliberately, holding her TSF steady despite every instinct screaming to break formation and put distance between her cockpit and the thing 300 meters below. You said less time than we think. Less time until what? The answer came without hesitation, without the careful weighing the previous night's exchange had carried. Until the hive rebuilds what I took from it last night and comes back with numbers instead of a fort class it was too proud to reinforce properly. It will. Hives learn, Slower than I'd like, but they learn. When it comes back, I want to know whether your kind stands with me against it, or gets in my way trying to protect something you've already lost. It's talking about the hive mounting a counteroffensive, Takamura relayed, voice tight. It wants a commitment, alliance or obstruction. It doesn't believe neutrality is a real option going forward. Down at direct command, General Chidori Gafuchi's voice came back clipped and careful. Ask what alliance would require of us specifically. Don't commit to anything. Information only. Takamura relayed it, and felt, even through the cold remove of telepathic contact, something that might have been the swarm entity's version of amusement. Territory it doesn't need. Passage where I ask for it, without your artillery deciding to test my patience. And when the hive comes, don't get underfoot. A pause, and the quality of it shifted, colder. That's the whole offer. I'm not interested in your politics. I'm interested in whether you're an obstacle or you're not. It says the terms are territorial non-interference and passage rights, Takamura reported. It explicitly states disinterest in any broader political relationship. This isn't an alliance in any conventional sense. It's a non-aggression framework with conditions. That's not nothing. Whitfield's voice cut in from the command channel, and Jinguji, monitoring from Yukon, caught the particular eagerness in it that she'd come to recognize and distrust. A non-aggression framework with the single most effective anti-beta force we've encountered in this entire war is not something to dismiss out of hand. It is when the framework includes ceding territory to something we don't understand and can't currently stop. Reika snapped back. Passage rights. Non-interference. Do either of you hear what that actually means? It means when it decides it wants Yukon bases ground, or Seidogashima's, the agreement it just offered, explicitly requires we not get underfoot. It hasn't asked for that, Whitfield said. It hasn't asked for that yet, Reika said. Chidori Gafuchi's voice cut through both of them, tired in a way Jinguji hadn't heard from him before. Takamura, withdraw the flight. We are not negotiating a strategic framework over a live comm channel with a single pilot as our entire diplomatic apparatus. This requires actual deliberation, and it requires it away from a live contact situation. Return to base. The withdrawal this time drew no response from the ground at all. Kerrigan simply watched them go, wings folded, unmoved by the retreat, in a way that told Takamura, more clearly than anything said in the exchange, that the entity considered the conversation adjourned rather than concluded, on its own schedule rather than direct commands. It was on the flight back that Kriska's voice came through the comm, quieter than usual, carrying something that sounded almost like dread. Takamura, I felt something else down there, not from the entity directly, from the ground itself, from whatever those structures are. I don't have the vocabulary for it. It felt like, she stopped, searching. It felt like listening to a heartbeat that belongs to something enormous, and realizing you're standing inside its ribcage. That's not reassuring, Michael said. It's not meant to be, Kriska said. I don't think what's growing down there is just infrastructure the way Yuko described it. I think it's connected to something. I don't know what or where, but it didn't feel local. It felt like this is a small piece of something much larger listening back. Yuko Kozuki heard Kriska's debrief secondhand within the hour, and it troubled her enough that she spent the following 2 hours cross-referencing every anomalous data point from the overnight sensor logs against Seidogashima's deep archive on unexplained phenomena, old records, mostly speculative, some dating back to the earliest days of the alternative program, when researchers had first begun documenting the strange psionic bleed-through that certain human inspectors displayed in proximity to specific beta variants. She found what she was looking for at 1730, and didn't like it. Petrov, she said, pulling up a comparison chart on the main screen. Look at this. The psionic signature Kriska described. the sense of something larger listening through the local structures. That's not unprecedented. It's structurally similar, though scaled up enormously, to the coordination signature we've documented in hive mind beta command relays. A hive isn't just a nest. It's a distributed processing structure, and every unit in its territory is, to some degree, an extension of that structure's awareness. You think the swarm works the same way, Petrov said. I think, Yuko said slowly, that we may be looking at two different distributed intelligences that happen to share an operating principle, even though everything else about them is completely alien to each other. Which would mean this isn't really a battle between an unstoppable individual and the beta hive. It's a battle between two hive minds, and the individual we've been negotiating with is functionally a highly capable extension of something much larger that we haven't even glimpsed yet. Petrov was quiet for a long moment. That changes the calculus on everything Whitfield's been proposing, he said finally. You don't negotiate a limited resource sharing agreement with a distributed intelligence the way you negotiate with an individual actor. Every local concession becomes part of a much bigger pattern we can't see the shape of. Which is exactly why I need this in front of direct command before the 0900 tomorrow, Yuko said, already pulling the data together. Because if I'm right, whatever Takamura negotiates in the field isn't a treaty with a person. It's a treaty with an entire species worth of intent, filtered through one convenient mouthpiece. And I don't think anyone in that conference room fully understands what they'd actually be agreeing to. She never got the chance to present it that evening, because at 21:40, while Jinguji was still compiling the day's reconnaissance report for the morning briefing, a comm alert flagged an unauthorized flight departure from Yukon's secondary hangar, a single TSF, transponder squawking a maintenance test code that didn't match any scheduled activity on the night's roster. Identify that flight, Jinguji snapped, already moving toward the hangar bay monitors. The answer, when it came, made her blood go cold. Pilot ID confirms Thomas Matthias. Flight plan filed as routine equipment shakedown. Current vector. The analyst's voice tightened. Current vector is direct toward the contact site coordinates. That's not a shakedown flight, Jinguji said. Get me Matthias on comm, now. Matthias didn't answer the first hail, or the second. It was Rusanov, scrambled from standby with Takamura and Michael close behind, who finally raised him on a tight beam channel 4 minutes into pursuit, voice cold with the particular fury of a squadron commander watching one of his own break formation without cause. Matthias, report your intentions, immediately. The reply that came back carried a strain that told its own story before the words did. I've got orders, Rusanov. Direct orders, above the squadron chain. Sample recovery. There's biological material at the engagement site from last night. Carcass remnants the swarm hasn't cleared yet. Fragments outside the main perimeter. I'm authorized to recover a specimen for analysis. Authorized by whom? Rusanov demanded, though the answer was already obvious to everyone listening. The silence that followed was answer enough. Command, this is Rusanov. I have confirmation of an unauthorized covert sample recovery operation inbound to the contact site. Pilot claims separate command authorization outside squadron chain, he reported, fury barely restrained, requesting immediate clarification on whether this operation has actual sanction, because if it doesn't, we have a pilot about to trigger a violation of the non-interference terms currently under negotiation. Jinguji's voice came back sharp enough to cut. Negative on sanctioned operation from this command. Matthias, abort immediately and return to base. I can't, Matthias said, and something in his voice had gone thin and desperate in a way that made Takamura's stomach drop even before he finished the sentence. I'm already inside the perimeter. I have a specimen. I'm bringing it back. The head of them, through the darkening Alaskan dusk, the reconnaissance formation caught sight of Matthias's TSF at the very edge of the swarm's expanding territory. crouched low over the torn ground near a cluster of beta remains, one manipulator arm extended toward a fragment of chitin, plating half buried in the purple-black creep, and rising behind him. Unhurried, wings unfolding with the same terrible patience Takamura remembered from the first encounter, the pale silhouette of Kerrigan herself, already turning to face the trespass with an expression that carried, even at this distance, absolutely no ambiguity about what came next. "Matthias, get out of there now," Takamura shouted over the open channel, throttle already slamming forward, weapons coming hot despite every standing order to the contrary. "Abort the recovery, it's not worth." The violet bolt took Matthias's TSF across the shoulder actuator before he'd even fully turned to run, the same precise, surgical strike Michael had survived 2 nights before, except this time, at closer range, with no warning and no room to maneuver. The frame didn't just breach, it came apart. "Matthias is down," Rusanov's voice cracked across the comm, all discipline gone in the raw shock of it. "Matthias is down. I need a recovery beacon. There isn't time," Takamura said, and hated herself for how flat and cold the words came out even as she said them. Because it was true. Because she'd watched enough catastrophic hull failures in 3 years to recognize one that offered no possibility of survival, and Matthias's had been total. "Rusanov, there isn't time." Above the wreckage, Kerrigan turned, unhurried, and looked directly at the 3 remaining TSFs holding position at the edge of what had, until 4 minutes ago, been a fragile and carefully negotiated peace. "I told your commander not to get underfoot," the voice said inside Takamura's skull, and for the first time it carried something that was unmistakably, coldly, an edge of genuine anger. "That was a test of a boundary you'd already agreed to respect. You failed it in less than a day." "That wasn't sanctioned," Takamura sent back, fighting to keep the exchange from becoming the second catastrophic failure of the night. "That pilot acted outside authorized command. It was not the position of this base, and it was not the position of the people negotiating with you." A long pause. "Then your command doesn't control its own people as well as it wants me to believe it does." The wings folded, and the figure turned away from the wreckage without further comment, leaving Matthias's remains where they'd fallen, offering neither retaliation nor mercy, simply indifference restored to its earlier, colder register. "Tell them the terms just got worse. And tell them if it happens again, I won't bother distinguishing between the pilot who broke them and the command that sent him." Takamura held position for a long, silent moment after the figure had withdrawn back toward the settlement, watching the purple-black creep pulse faintly in the deepening dark around what remained of a man who, 3 hours ago, had been eating dinner in the same mess hall she had. "Command," she said finally, voice carrying none of the composure she'd managed through every exchange before this one. "We need General Chidorigafuchi on this channel immediately. Because someone outside this squadron just cost us a pilot, and I need to know who authorized it before I fly another sortie, under orders I can't verify are actually coming from people who want this war to end, rather than people who want a specimen." Behind her, in the freezing Alaskan dark, the rift pulsed once above the growing settlement, and for the first time since it had opened, Takamura found herself uncertain whether the greater danger tonight had come from the swarm at all. General Chidorigafuchi came onto the channel 11 minutes later, and the first thing he did was silence Whitfield before the colonel had said a full sentence. "Colonel Whitfield," he said, "did you authorize Pilot Matthias's sortie?" The pause that followed was too long to be anything but confirmation, and Jinguji, watching the exchange unfold on the secure line from Yukon's command room, felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. "I authorized a sample recovery contingency," Whitfield said finally, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man who had already begun building his defense before the question was even asked. Standing Joint Assessment Protocol permits independent tactical initiative when a time-sensitive research opportunity presents itself outside the primary chain's operational tempo. I did not order him into direct contact with the hostile command entity. I authorized recovery of unclaimed biological material at the perimeter edge, which every available intelligence at the time suggested was unmonitored. "A pilot is dead," Chidori Gafuchi said, and his voice, usually so carefully modulated, carried an edge now that made even Whitfield go quiet for a moment. "A pilot under my theater command took an unsanctioned sortie, under your authorization, into an active negotiation zone. Less than 6 hours after this command explicitly agreed to a non-interference framework with the entity in question. I do not care what protocol you believe covers your authority to do that. You will explain, in writing to me, before this hour is finished, exactly what chain of approval permitted you to send a pilot to his death without informing the officer responsible for that pilot's safety. General, with respect, the Joint Assessment Office operates under a separate. I am aware of the office's charter, Colonel," Chidori Gafuchi said. "I am also aware that charter does not supersede operational authority over assets assigned to Yukon base, and I intend to have that clarified at a level considerably above either of us before this conversation is finished. For now, you are removed from any operational input regarding the contact situation, pending review. Is that understood?" There was a long silence, and when Whitfield spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier smoothness entirely. "Understood, General." The line clicked, and Jinguji realized, with a strange mixture of relief and unease, that removing Whitfield from operational input did nothing at all to uncost Matthias's life, and did nothing to guarantee that whatever office he answered to wouldn't simply route its ambitions through a different channel entirely. Rusanov did not attend the debrief that followed. He sat instead in the empty ready room, still in half his flight suit, staring at a wall locker with Matthias's name still stenciled on it, and when Takamura found him there an hour later, he didn't look up. "I should have caught it faster," he said. "The transponder squawk. The flight plan. I've flown with that man for 2 years. I should have known a shakedown flight vector doesn't run straight at the contact site." "You didn't have the authorization data," Takamura said. "None of us did. Whitfield made sure of that." "That's not the point," Rusanov said, and his voice cracked, just slightly. The first crack Takamura had ever heard in 3 years of flying beside him. "The point is, I'm the one who's supposed to keep this squadron alive against Beta. I never once considered I'd need to keep them alive against our own command structure." He looked up at her finally, eyes red-rimmed and furious. "What do we tell people that thing said? That it's willing to kill one of ours over a piece of dead chitin, and we're supposed to keep believing a non-interference agreement with something that doesn't distinguish between the man who broke it and the command that sent him?" "I don't know," Takamura admitted, "but I don't think the answer is that the agreement's worthless. I think the answer is that we can't afford another Whitfield deciding unilaterally what its terms are worth breaking." Rusanov didn't answer that. He just looked back at the locker, and Takamura left him there, because there was nothing in 3 years of shared combat that had prepared either of them for grief shaped like this, not lost to the enemy in open battle, but lost to their own side's hunger for an advantage nobody yet understood how to hold. At Sadogashima, 400 kilometers south, Colonel Reika convened her own smaller briefing, with the officers directly under her command, and did not soften anything for their benefit. "I want everyone in this room to understand something clearly," she said. "What happened last night at Yukon was not an aberration. It was a preview. There is a faction within Direct Command's broader structure, and I am being deliberately vague about which office, because it is bigger than one colonel with poor judgment, that sees an unstoppable extermination weapon and thinks the appropriate response is acquisition, not caution. That faction just got a pilot killed, testing the boundary of an agreement none of us fully trust in the first place. It will try again, possibly more carefully next time, possibly with better cover. "What's our position, ma'am?" asked a young lieutenant near the back, one of Sadogashima's newer arrivals, still carrying the particular unshaken optimism of someone who hadn't yet watched enough of this war go wrong. "Our position," Reika said, "is that we prepare artillery interdiction on the contact zone as a standing contingency regardless of what direct command decides diplomatically, because I will not be caught unprepared if that framework collapses entirely. And our position is that every officer under my command understands, explicitly, that unsanctioned initiative against the entity, regardless of what justification some office 3 ranks removed offers you, will end your career at minimum, and quite possibly your life. I've watched Yukon lose a pilot to ambition tonight. I don't intend to lose one of mine the same way." Back at Yukon, Yuko Kuzuki finally got her briefing in front of direct command the following morning, delayed a day by the fallout from Matthias's death but no less urgent for the wait, and the room that received it was considerably smaller and considerably more sober than the one that had argued over territorial concessions 2 days before. "I need everyone to understand the structural implications of what I'm about to show you," she said, pulling up the comparative analysis she'd built the previous evening. "The entity Takamura has been in contact with is not, in my assessment, an independent actor in any sense we'd normally use that word." The coordination signature, Kriska Barchanova reported, "The sense of something vastly larger listening through the local structures corresponds closely to what we've documented in beta hive mind command relays, except scaled to a degree that suggests a governing intelligence of, at minimum, comparable scope to a full beta hive network, and possibly considerably larger." "You're saying we're not negotiating with an individual," Chidori Gafuchi said slowly. "We're negotiating with an extension of something we haven't even glimpsed the true size of." "That's my assessment, yes," Yuko said. "Which means every concession made in the field, territorial non-interference, passage rights, whatever specific terms Takamura is able to extract or is pressured into accepting, isn't a bilateral agreement between 2 actors of comparable standing. It's a local arrangement with a single node of something enormously larger, and that larger intelligence's actual priorities, its actual scale of ambition, remain entirely unknown to us. We don't know if what's establishing itself in the gray belt is the whole of what came through that rift, or a scouting fragment of something considerably worse." The room absorbed that in silence. "What do you recommend?" Chidori Gafuchi asked finally. "I recommend we stop treating this as diplomacy with a person and start treating it as intelligence gathering on a species," Yuko said. "Every exchange Takamura has should be logged not as a negotiation transcript, but as a data source on an unknown intelligence's operating principles, its priorities, its tolerances. And I recommend, with respect to the recovery ambitions some parts of this command clearly still hold." She didn't look at where Whitfield would have been sitting, though everyone in the room understood the reference, "that we treat any attempt to acquire samples or leverage as, at minimum, equivalent in risk to provoking a second hive rather than a contained skirmish with a single unit. Because if I'm right about the scale of what's actually listening on the other side of that rift, provoking it carelessly could cost considerably more than 1 pilot." General Chidori Gafuchi was quiet for a long moment, looking at the imaging of the rift still displayed on the main screen, its edges pulsing faint violet green against the gray Alaskan morning behind it. "Get me everything Takamura's contact has produced," he said finally. "Every exchange, verbatim. I want analysts building a behavioral model of this thing's priorities starting today, and I want it built on the assumption that Dr. Kuzuki is right about the scale of what we're actually dealing with." He looked up, meeting the room's collective unease with a steadiness that Jinguji found, despite everything, faintly reassuring. Because if this is the opening move of something considerably larger than a single queen and her local swarm, I would like this command to understand what we're facing before it decides to show us the rest of itself. Outside, 4 kilometers north, the purple-black creep continued its slow, methodical spread across the gray belt, and within it, unseen by any human sensor yet capable of parsing its true depth, something patient and vast continued the work it had already begun the moment the rift first tore open, building, consolidating, and waiting, with the particular unhurried confidence of something that had done this before, on other worlds, against other doomed and desperate defenders, and had never yet found a reason to hurry. The hive rebuilt faster than anyone at Yukon wanted to believe possible. 3 days after the Fort-class kill, satellite imaging showed troop mobilization patterns radiating out from the hive's core structure, at a density Yuko's team hadn't recorded since the earliest, most desperate phases of the Alaska campaign. Soldier-class formations forming in numbers that suggested the hive wasn't simply replacing losses, but actively reallocating resources from other fronts toward this single contested sector. It's treating the swarm as a priority threat above baseline territorial defense, Yuko reported at the morning briefing, voice tight with the particular strain of someone who'd slept even less than usual. This isn't the hive's normal response curve to a localized incursion. This is closer to what we'd expect if it had reclassified the entire sector as an existential-level threat to itself. Meaning it's scared, Petrov said. Meaning it's responding as though it understands what scared would mean, Yuko corrected, which is frankly more troubling than if it were simply reacting on instinct. Something about that first engagement taught the hive's command structure a lesson it's now acting on, with real strategic coherence. General Chidori Fuchi, watching the imaging with the flat patience Jinguji had come to associate with a man carrying more weight than his rank technically required, asked the question everyone in the room had been avoiding. Timeline to counteroffensive. Best estimate, 72 hours, Yuko said, possibly less. And doctor, she hesitated, glancing at the wider imaging feed. We're seeing something else in the build-up pattern I want to flag before I have full confirmation. Elevated laser-class signature density in the assembling force, well above what we'd expect for a standard counteroffensive against a localized incursion. You're saying it's bringing dedicated anti-armor saturation fire against something that isn't armor, Rusinov said, arms folded near the back of the room, still carrying the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept properly since Matthias's death. I'm saying, Yuko said carefully, that the hive appears to have correctly identified, from a single engagement, that conventional physical strikes were insufficient against the swarm's regenerative capability, and has escalated to a weapons class explicitly designed to overwhelm that capability through sustained energy saturation, rather than kinetic damage. That's not instinct. That's adaptation on a timescale I've never documented before. The room absorbed that in silence, and Jinguji felt, not for the first time in the last 3 days, the particular vertigo of watching two forces she barely understood teach each other new and worse ways to fight. Takamura flew reconnaissance again that afternoon, alone this time by her own request, arguing successfully to Jinguji that a single TSF drew less attention and provoked less risk of the kind of misunderstanding that had cost Matthias his life. She held position at the settlement's edge, watching the purple-black creep, now covering nearly 2 kilometers of the gray belt corridor, pulse with its slow organic rhythm beneath a sky gone heavy and gray with incoming weather. Kerrigan met her there without being summoned, landing on a jagged spur of the alien structure with the unhurried economy of something that had never once needed to hurry for a human. Your people are gathering their nerve, the voice said inside Takamura's skull, carrying an edge of something that might have been amusement if amusement meant anything cold and distant to whatever generated it. 3 days since your pilot broke the agreement, and still no artillery. I'm almost impressed by the restraint. The pilot who broke it has been removed from operational authority, Takamura said aloud, because she'd learned by now that speaking the words, even when the entity received them some other way entirely, helped her hold the exchange at a distance she could survive. That wasn't sanctioned by this command. I told you that already. You told me, Kerrigan agreed. I decided to believe you. That's more generosity than I usually extend to anything this fragile. The wings shifted, a slow settling motion. Your hive is mobilizing. I can feel it building the way you'd feel weather coming. It learned something from the last fight. That's inconvenient but not surprising. Hives always learn eventually. Slower than mine ever has to, but eventually. You said hives, Takamura said carefully. You keep drawing that comparison. Yuko, one of our researchers, thinks you're not acting alone, that whatever you are is connected to something considerably larger than what we're seeing here. For the first time in every exchange Takamura had catalogued since first contact, there was a pause before the answer came, not evasive exactly, but weighing, as if deciding how much truth cost less than a convenient lie. Your researcher isn't wrong, Kerrigan said finally. What's here is mine. What's connected to it is considerably older and considerably larger than anything you've built a word for yet. I don't answer to it the way your soldiers answer to your command structure. It's closer to... Another pause. Hunting, Takamura realized with something like disorientation, for a concept that would translate. Closer to how a hand answers to a body it stopped needing constant instruction from. I act. It knows what I do. Neither of us finds that arrangement troubling. And if it decided it wanted more than this, Takamura said, more than one settlement in one dead stretch of ground, then you'd know, Kerrigan said, because the ground you're standing on would already belong to it, and you'd be having this conversation with considerably less patience than I've shown you. The violet eyes fixed on Takamura's cockpit, with an intensity that made the cold outside her canopy feel suddenly much colder. I haven't decided that yet. Whether I decide it partly depends on what your kind does in the next 72 hours, when your hive comes back with its new saturation weapons and expects me to be surprised by them. You already know about the laser class buildup, Takamura said, and it wasn't quite a question. I know everything happening within the range my broods can sense, Kerrigan said. Your hive isn't subtle. It never has been, has it? Slow, patient, overwhelming through numbers rather than intelligence. The way things that have never needed cunning fight when cunning finally becomes necessary. Something in the quality of the thought shifted, colder. I don't intend to lose to a saturation tactic I've already seen coming for 2 days. But I want your hive's answer to be delivered before mine, this time. I'm curious whether your command finally understands the value of moving faster than the war does, or whether it needs another dead pilot to learn that lesson too. Takamura held the exchange in silence for a moment, feeling the particular vertigo of being tested by something that clearly already knew the shape of the answer it expected. I'll relay it, she said finally, but I want something from you in return. A warning. If the counteroffensive changes your position toward us. I don't want another pilot finding out the terms have changed by dying inside them. Kerrigan tilted her head, the same unsettlingly human gesture from the first encounter, and for a moment, something in the cold calculation behind those violet eyes shifted into something almost, impossibly, like respect. That's the first useful thing anyone from your side has asked me for, she said. Fine. If the terms change, you'll know before your pilots do. Not because I owe you kindness, because a warning costs me nothing and buys me a version of your species that trusts my word slightly further than it currently does. That's still just math, Takamura. Don't mistake it for anything warmer. The relay reached direct command within the hour, and this time, for the first time since the crisis began, the briefing that followed carried something closer to unified urgency than factional argument. 72 hours, possibly less, before a beta counteroffensive employing saturation-tier anti-armor weapons against a target that isn't armor, Chidori Gafuchi summarized, looking around the room at Reika, at Jinguji, at the empty seat where Whitfield's feed had once occupied a place at the table, and an entity that has, for reasons of its own calculation, rather than any warmth toward us, offered advance warning if its position changes. I want recommendations, and I want them fast, because I don't believe we have the luxury of another 2 days of committee argument this time. We prepare our own contingency, independent of whatever happens between the swarm and the hive, Rika said immediately. If the counteroffensive breaks the current standoff and either side pushes toward human territory in the aftermath, whichever side wins, we need defensive posture ready at Yukon and Setogashima both, not scrambled together after the fact. Agreed, Chidori Gafuchi said. And regarding the counteroffensive itself, do we interfere, support, or observe? The question hung in the room for a long moment, and it was Jinguji, unexpectedly, who answered first. I don't think we're positioned to meaningfully interfere either way, she said. We don't have a weapon that's proven effective against either force independently, let alone both simultaneously. What we have is an opportunity to gather the kind of data Dr. Kazuki's been asking for, how the hive's new weapons perform, how the swarm adapts to them, whether either side shows a vulnerability we haven't seen yet. I recommend full reconnaissance posture, maximum standoff distance, and absolute non-engagement, unless our own forces are directly threatened. That's watching 2 extinction-level threats fight without intervening either way, Reika said. I understand the intelligence value. I want it on record that I find something deeply uncomfortable about treating that as a spectator sport. Nodded, Chidori Gafuchi said, and agreed regardless, because Jinguji is right that we don't currently have better options. Full reconnaissance posture, all squadrons on standby, and Dr. Kozuki. He looked toward Yuko's feed. I want your team's full attention on that battle the moment it begins. Whatever data comes out of it may be the only advantage this war produces from any of this. 71 hours later, in the gray pre-dawn dark of an Alaskan morning gone bitter with an early cold front, the hive moved. It came not as the ragged vanguard of the first engagement, but as something closer to a full theater commitment. Soldier-class formations in numbers that dwarfed anything Takamura had seen thrown at a single contested sector in 3 years of war. Laser-class units, interspersed throughout the formation, in a density that told its own story about what lesson the hive had actually absorbed. And behind them, moving with the ponderous inevitability of something that had learned, this time, not to commit its heaviest asset carelessly at the front, a destroyer-class beta, the largest confirmed unit type on this entire front, held in reserve at the formation's rear like an argument the hive intended to win, regardless of what its vanguard cost it. Above the gray belt, 4 TSFs held reconnaissance position at maximum safe distance, and Takamura, watching the 2 extinction-grade forces converge for the second time in a week, found herself hoping, despite every professional instinct telling her hope was the wrong tool for this moment, that whatever answer this battle produced would be one humanity could actually survive learning. The hive's vanguard hit the settlement's outer perimeter at 05:12, and for the first 90 seconds, it looked almost like the first engagement all over again. Soldier-class formations breaking against a wall of swarm creatures that met them with the same precise, economical violence Takamura remembered from a week ago. Chitin and biomechanical flesh tearing into each other, under a sky still dark enough that the muzzle flare of laser-class fire lit the battlefield in long, stuttering pulses of harsh white light. Then the laser-class units opened up in earnest, and the character of the battle changed. Command, I'm seeing something new in the swarm's response, Takamura reported. watching through her scope as the first sustained saturation barrage caught a cluster of creatures mid-engagement. The regenerative capability that made conventional ordnance ineffective last time, it's not holding up the same way against sustained energy fire. I'm seeing actual kills, multiple kills. It was true, and it unsettled her more than she expected. Where solid rounds had glanced off wounds that closed almost as fast as they opened, the concentrated heat of laser-class fire, applied continuously rather than in a single strike, was overwhelming the regeneration outright. Creatures caught in the beam simply burned, chitin blackening and curling before the healing process could catch up to the damage. And for the first time since the crossover had begun, Takamura watched swarm creatures actually die and stay dead. "They're adjusting," Kriska said sharply, from her position 200 meters off Takamura's wing. "Look at the formation shift. They're not holding ground against the laser-class fire anymore. They're breaking contact and forcing the soldier-class escorts into close engagement instead, where the beam weapons can't fire without risking their own units." She was right. The swarm's tactics, which had shown a terrible, coordinated confidence in the first engagement, had shifted within minutes of the new threat's introduction into something more fluid, almost evasive. Creatures peeling away from direct energy exposure, forcing melee engagements where their raw physical capabilities still held every advantage, funneling the beta vanguard into corridors of ground where the laser-class support units couldn't fire without catching their own forces in the blast radius. "It's learning in real time," Rusanov said, disbelief plain in his voice even after everything he'd already watched this front produce. "Mid-battle, not between engagements. During one. So is the hive," Michael said, and pointed toward the formation's rear, where the destroyer class had begun, at last, to move. It came forward with a deliberate, unhurried mass that made the ground itself shudder even at this distance, and Takamura felt something in her chest tighten at the sight of it. She had seen destroyer-class units exactly twice in 3 years of combat, both times as the terminal escalation of engagements that had already cost her squadron pilots she still thought about, and both times the sheer scale of the thing had made every human weapon on the field feel, for a long, terrible moment, like a rounding error. The swarm did not break formation at its approach. If anything, Takamura thought she detected something in the reorganizing pattern below that looked almost like anticipation. Creatures consolidating toward the destroyer's projected path rather than away from it. And near the center of that consolidation, wings spread, violet energy already gathering visibly around clawed hands. Kerrigan herself moved to meet it. "She's going for the destroyer class personally," Kriska said, voice tight. "That's not tactics. That's a direct confrontation between command-tier assets." "Command, be advised," Takamura reported, throat dry. "The entity is engaging the destroyer class directly. I need everyone to understand what we're about to watch, because I don't think either of these things has ever lost one of these fights before." Yuko Kozuki watched the engagement unfold on Yukon's main analysis screen with the same fixed, unblinking attention she gave every piece of critical data this war produced, and found herself, despite 3 years of hardened professional distance, unable to look away from what followed. The destroyer class opened with its primary weapon system, a sustained particle beam discharge that Yuko's team had clocked, in prior engagements, as sufficient to level a city block in a single pass. And Kerrigan did not dodge it, did not retreat from it, met it instead with both clawed hands raised, and something that could only be described, in the total absence of any better vocabulary, as raw psionic force pushed directly against the beam's leading edge. For 4 seconds, the two forces held against each other in a visible standoff that lit the whole battlefield in stark violet white. The beam's discharge visibly warping and scattering against whatever barrier Kerrigan had thrown up. And then, with a violence that registered on every sensor Yuko's team had trained on the site, the confrontation resolved, not in Kerrigan's favor cleanly, Not in the destroyer's favor either, but in a mutual, staggering exchange that sent the Queen of Blades tumbling backward across 200 meters of torn ground, even as the destroyer class staggered under a counterstrike that peeled armor plating from its forward hull in a shower of alien fire. "She's hurt," Petrov said, watching Kerrigan struggle upright from the wreckage of her own impact crater. "Genuinely hurt. That's the first time we've seen that." "So is it," Yuko said, pointing at the destroyer class, whose forward plating had not regenerated the way beta armor typically self-repaired under sustained field conditions, the exposed wound smoking visibly even at this distance. Neither of them has an easy answer for the other. This is the first genuinely even fight either side has had in this entire conflict. Above the battlefield, Takamura watched Kerrigan rise from the crater with the specific, terrible focus of something recalibrating rather than retreating, and felt, despite every reason she had to want the swarm defeated as much as the beta, an unwilling flicker of something like respect for the sheer refusal to yield that the movement carried. The destroyer class advanced again, main weapon cycling for a second discharge, and this time Kerrigan did not meet it head-on. She broke sideways at a speed that shouldn't have been available to something still visibly wounded, wings snapping open, and struck not at the weapon system directly, but at the network of secondary sensor clusters along the destroyer's flank. The same precise, surgical targeting Takamura had watched destroy the Fort class a week ago, applied now against a target an order of magnitude larger, and this time the strikes did not simply damage. They blinded, one cluster after another going dark under concentrated violet strikes, until the destroyer's massive primary weapon, still charging for its second discharge, swung wide of its actual target entirely, and carved a smoking furrow through open ground instead. "She's not trying to kill it outright," Kriska said, watching the pattern with the particular intensity of someone parsing tactics rather than spectacle. "She's blinding it, taking away its ability to aim, rather than trying to overpower its raw output directly." "Smart," Rusanov admitted grudgingly. "Fight the weapon's control system instead of the weapon itself." The destroyer class, deprived of coherent targeting, began firing in wide, uncoordinated arcs that tore through its own supporting soldier class formations as often as they threatened the swarm at all. And in the chaos that followed, the swarm creatures below pressed the advantage with a coordinated ferocity that made clear the hive's carefully rebuilt vanguard was, within minutes, being ground down faster than it could be replaced. It took 11 more minutes for the destroyer class to fall, brought down finally not by any single decisive strike but by the accumulated weight of a dozen precise wounds, delivered while it thrashed blind and disoriented across ground already thick with the wreckage of its own escort force. And when it finally collapsed, the sound of its fall carried across 4 kilometers of freezing dark, like the end of something that had, until this morning, seemed permanent. The battlefield went quiet in the aftermath, in a way that felt, to every human watching it, more unsettling than the violence that had preceded it. The surviving swarm creatures consolidating once more around the wreckage with their now familiar methodical purpose, and at the center of it, Kerrigan standing amid the ruin of the largest confirmed beta unit type on the entire front, wings torn in 3 places, one arm held at an angle that suggested genuine injury rather than performance, and yet standing all the same. "That cost more than the last one," the voice said inside Takamura's skull, and for the first time since first contact, it carried something that wasn't cold calculation at all, something closer, disturbingly, to genuine effort acknowledged. "Your hive is learning faster than I expected. That's inconvenient. It means the next one costs more still." "You won," Takamura said, because it seemed important to say, even knowing the entity required no validation from her at all. "I won this one," Kerrigan corrected, and the distinction carried a weight Takamura understood immediately, the particular cold clarity of something that had survived exactly, by never mistaking a single victory for a settled war. Your hive just proved it can hurt something I've never lost a fight to before this planet. That changes my calculations. I don't know yet whether it changes them toward you or away from you. Meaning what? Takamura asked. Meaning I need to decide, soon, whether this world's hive is worth the effort of a slow contest of attrition, or whether I need to end this faster than I'd prefer, Kerrigan said, and the cold behind the words carried, for the first time, something that felt uncomfortably close to a genuine and unwelcome uncertainty. Faster usually means messier, and messier tends not to distinguish carefully between what's actually my enemy and what simply happens to be standing nearby. She turned away without waiting for a response, wings dragging slightly from the injury, and began the slow return toward the settlement center, leaving Takamura hanging in the freezing dark above a battlefield littered with the wreckage of the largest beta unit anyone at Yukon had ever seen fall. Uncertain whether what she'd just heard was a warning, a genuine admission of doubt, or the first sign that the careful, cold arithmetic holding this fragile arrangement together had just tipped, in ways nobody on the human side yet fully understood, toward something considerably less patient. The message arrived through a channel that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Jinguji found it flagged in the base's secure comm log 3 days after the destroyer-class kill, buried in a routine maintenance data burst that any automated system would have passed over without a second glance, except the encryption signature matched nothing in Yukon's registered communications architecture, and when her signals officer finally cracked it open, what surfaced turned her stomach in a way 3 years of beta warfare never quite had. It was a standing requisition order, dated 2 days after Whitfield's removal from operational input, routed through a designation she didn't recognize, requesting, in language careful enough to survive a casual audit, recoverable biological material from the Alaska contact zone, priority handling, destination Sadogashima Auxiliary Research Annex, requisitioning authority, Joint Tactical Assessment Office, secondary channel. He's still running it, she said, staring at the screen with a cold that had nothing to do with the Alaskan morning outside. Removed from operational input, and he's still running the exact program that got Matthias killed, just routed around the part of the chain that would say no. Petrov, reading over her shoulder, went pale. That's not insubordination. That's a black budget operation running parallel to an active diplomatic framework we're all still trying to keep from collapsing. Get me everything on the secondary channel designation, Jinguji said. Every transmission, every requisition, going back to the day Whitfield was removed. I want to know exactly how much of this has already happened without my knowledge. What her signals officer found over the following 6 hours was worse than she'd braced for. 3 separate covert recovery attempts in the days since Matthias's death. 2 of them aborted before reaching the contact zone after ground teams reported unspecified anomalous conditions that read, in the sanitized language of the after-action logs, like a polite way of describing something that had frightened trained soldiers badly enough to turn back without orders to do so. The 3rd attempt, 4 days ago, had apparently succeeded. A small ground team, operating under civilian contractor cover rather than uniformed authority, extracting a fragment of swarm creature carapace from the perimeter edge of territory Kerrigan's forces had, at the time, been fully occupied fighting off the beta counteroffensive. They used the battle as cover, Jinguji said, reading the report a second time to be certain she hadn't misunderstood it. While the entity was fighting for its life against a destroyer class, while we were all watching that battle and calling it an intelligence-gathering opportunity, someone was on the ground stealing from it. She brought it to Chidori Gafuchi within the hour, and watched a man she'd come to respect over 3 years of shared crisis go very quiet in a way that told her more clearly than any words how badly this news landed. I removed him from operational input, Chidori Gafuchi said finally. I did not have the authority to remove him from his office entirely. That requires a review process above my rank, and I initiated it. But reviews take time this situation apparently didn't allow him to wait for. He looked up, and something in his expression had gone harder than Jinguji had seen from him before. Do we have confirmation the entity is aware of the theft? No confirmation either way, Jinguji said. But given what she told Takamura after the destroyer-class fight, that she needed to decide whether this world's conflict was worth a slow contest of attrition, or whether she needed to end things faster, I don't think we can assume ignorance is doing us any favors. If she finds out on her own terms rather than ours, I don't think our explanation afterward is going to land the way it might if we get ahead of it. Chidori Gafuchi was quiet for a long moment, weighing something Jinguji suspected had less to do with strategy than with a decision he'd clearly been avoiding making for days. Get Takamura on the line, he said finally. I want her to tell the entity, directly, before anyone else has the chance to spin it into something more forgivable than it actually was. Full disclosure, the theft, the office responsible, the fact that this command did not authorize it, and has been actively working to shut it down since discovering it. He met Jinguji's eyes. If this framework survives on anything, it survives on the entity believing our word means something, even when our own people fail to keep it. I'd rather it hear the truth from us, badly as it reflects on us, than piece together a lie later and decide the entire arrangement was worthless from the start. Takamura flew out that afternoon under gray skies threatening the season's first real snow, and found Kerrigan waiting at the settlement's edge with a stillness that carried, even before any word passed between them, the particular weight of something that already knew what was coming. "You've found something you don't want to tell me," the voice said inside her skull before Takamura had even formed the words. "I can feel it in how carefully you're approaching this. Say it plainly. I have less patience for careful phrasing than you might hope. A fragment of biological material was stolen from your territory 4 days ago," Takamura said, choosing directness over any attempt to soften it. "During the destroyer-class engagement, while your forces were fighting for survival, it was taken by a covert team operating under an office that was supposed to have been removed from any authority over this situation after they got one of my pilots killed, testing the same boundary. My command did not authorize it. My command has been trying to shut that office down since discovering it existed. I'm telling you this because you deserve to hear it from us rather than discover it yourself and decide we lied by omission." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Takamura began, despite every professional discipline built over 3 years of combat, to genuinely fear what came next. "You told me your pilot's death was unsanctioned," Kerrigan said finally, and the cold in the thought had a different quality than any Takamura had felt from her before. Not the flat calculation of the early exchanges, but something closer, unnervingly, to something that might have been called hurt, in anything capable of feeling it. "I chose to believe you. I extended something close to trust, which I do not do easily or often, because your species is small and fragile, and I had no particular reason to think its word carried weight. And in the same breath your command was making that assurance. A separate arm of the same species was already stealing from the ground I bled to hold." "Yes," Takamura said, because there was no version of this conversation where a lie would survive contact with something that clearly already sensed the shape of the truth before she'd finished speaking it. "That's the second time in a week your kind's internal divisions have cost this arrangement something it can't easily rebuild," Kerrigan said. "The first time, it cost your pilot his life. This time, it costs whatever fragile thing was starting to resemble trust between us." The wings shifted, a slow, deliberate settling that carried none of the earlier engagement's aggression, but none of its warmth either. A coldness restored to its original, careful register. "I want the office responsible for this identified to me by name. Not punished. That's your business, not mine. Identified. I want to know exactly which part of your command structure I need to stop extending any benefit of the doubt to, because clearly your species doesn't speak with one voice, and I've been treating you as though it did. I'll relay the request, Takamura said. I don't have the authority to grant it myself, but I believe my command will grant it, because I believe they understand what's at stake here, as clearly as I do. Because I'll tell you honestly, Takamura, since honesty seems to be the only currency either of us can currently afford, a week ago I would have answered a theft like this with retaliation proportional to the insult. I didn't, this time, because something about this exchange, about the specific way you chose to tell me, rather than let me discover it, made me curious whether your species is worth the patience I'm extending it. A pause, and the quality of the thought shifted, colder again. That patience isn't infinite, and it isn't universal. It exists for you, specifically, because you've been honest with me twice now when honesty cost you something. It does not exist yet, for whatever office thought stealing from a battlefield was an acceptable price for a research sample. If that office reaches for something a third time, I will not distinguish between it and the rest of your command the way I've chosen to so far. Takamura relayed the exchange in full that evening, watching General Chidori Gafuchi's expression harden through every sentence of it, and when she finished, the silence in the command room carried a different weight than any that had preceded it in the 2 weeks since the rift first opened. She's not wrong to hold this against us, Chidori Gafuchi said finally, and she's not wrong that the patience she's extending isn't universal. Colonel Reika warned us, from the very first briefing, that the day would come when this arrangement stopped being worth the entity's tolerance. I'd hoped that day would be forced by strategic necessity on both sides. I didn't expect it to be forced instead by one of our own offices deciding a research sample was worth risking everything the rest of us have been trying to build. He looked up, and something in his expression carried the particular exhaustion of a man watching a war he already understood as unwinnable acquire a second front he genuinely believed, for a brief and foolish week, they might have avoided. Get me the review board's timeline on Whitfield's office, he said. I want it accelerated, and I want the entity's specific request. Identification, not punishment, honored the moment that review concludes. Because whatever else is true about the thing Takamura's been negotiating with, it just showed considerably more restraint than the office responsible for provoking it. And I am not willing to let this command's own worst instincts be the reason a war we might have found some advantage in ends, instead in a fight none of us can win. Outside, the season's first real snow had begun falling over the gray belt, settling in pale drifts across ground still scarred from a destroyer-class Beta's final collapse. And 4 kilometers north, in the deepening cold of an Alaskan evening, the Queen of Blades stood at the edge of her settlement and considered, with the patient, merciless calculation of something that had survived exactly by never extending trust further than the evidence supported, exactly how much longer this particular arrangement was worth the restraint it was currently costing her. The review board concluded in 11 days, which everyone at Yukon understood to be either remarkably fast or suspiciously so, and the findings that came back landed with the particular unsatisfying weight of institutional truth. Colonel Whitfield had, indeed, authorized Matthias's sortie and the subsequent covert recovery operations under a standing charter provision that technically permitted independent tactical initiative for time-sensitive research opportunities, a provision, the board noted with careful bureaucratic neutrality, that had clearly been drafted for circumstances considerably less catastrophic than the one it had just been used to justify. He was reassigned rather than court-martialed, transferred to an advisory post at a research annex in Central Europe, with a title that sounded like a promotion to anyone who didn't understand what the sideways move actually meant. And Jinguji, reading the final determination in her quarters at 0200, because sleep had become an increasingly theoretical concept, felt something in her chest curdle into an anger she hadn't expected to still be carrying this strongly. He gets moved sideways, she said the next morning. to Chidori Fuchi's feed on the secure line, not bothering to soften it. A pilot is dead. An entity capable of leveling a destroyer-class beta has explicitly told us its patience with our species is conditional and running thin, and the man responsible for both of those facts gets a new office in Germany. I know, Chidori Fuchi said, and the flatness in his voice told her he'd fought harder on this than the outcome suggested. I want you to understand that I pushed for considerably more, and I lost that argument to people who outrank both of us by a distance you and I don't get visibility into. The charter provision he used is real. It was written before this war had produced anything like what we're dealing with now, by people who never imagined a contact scenario this fragile, and closing that loophole retroactively to punish one specific violation of it turned out to be a fight I couldn't win in 11 days, regardless of how many pilots' deaths I was willing to cite. So what do we tell the entity? Jinguji asked. That we identified the office responsible, exactly as it asked, and the consequence for nearly unraveling an entire diplomatic framework and getting one of our own killed was a change of address. Chidori Fuchi was quiet for a long moment. We tell it the truth, he said finally, because I don't think there's a version of this where we manage its expectations by softening what actually happened. It already understands, better than most of the people arguing about it in conference rooms, that our species doesn't speak with one voice. I'd rather it understand exactly how little authority I actually hold over the parts of that voice I don't control, than let it believe I have more power here than I do, and discover the gap the hard way, later, at a worse moment. Takamura relayed it that afternoon, standing the exchange with a directness that had become, over 3 weeks of contact, the only register that seemed to hold any value at all with the entity on the other end of it. A new office in a country I've never had reason to think about, Kerrigan said, and the coldness in the thought carried an edge that Takamura had learned, by now, to read as genuine and not merely performed. That's the consequence. Not removal from your command's authority structure entirely. Reassignment. I won't pretend that's satisfying, Takamura said. It's not satisfying to me either. But I think you already understand something about how large, divided command structures work, given what you've told me about your own. A hand doesn't always answer perfectly to the intention behind it, even when the intention is clear. There was a pause, longer than usual, and when the thought came back it carried something Takamura hadn't quite heard before. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. The sound of something updating a working model rather than simply reacting. That's a more honest answer than I expected, Kerrigan said. Most of what your species has offered me since first contact has been careful phrasing designed to sound better than the underlying fact. You keep choosing not to do that, I've noticed. The wings shifted, settling. I'll accept the consequences offered, not because it satisfies anything, but because you're right, that I understand the shape of an imperfect command structure better than most things in this universe would. What I want now is simpler than punishment. I want to know whether this is a pattern I should expect to repeat, or an aberration your command has actually contained. I can't promise it won't happen again, Takamura said. I can promise the people making decisions here understand, now, in a way they didn't 3 weeks ago, exactly what it costs when it does. That's honest. It's also the best I've got. It'll do, Kerrigan said, for now. 3 days later, the second front of the story that had been building quietly beneath the diplomatic crisis finally surfaced, and it came, unexpectedly, from Rusinov. He requested a private meeting with Jinguji late one evening, still in half his flight suit after a routine patrol, and the tension in his posture told her this wasn't going to be a conversation about maintenance schedules. I need to raise something that isn't going to be popular, he said, once the door had closed behind them. Moscow's liaison office reached out to me directly 2 days ago, not through Sadogashima's chain, not through Yukon's, directly, through a channel I didn't know I still had access to from my old unit. Jinguji felt something in her stomach tighten. Saying what? Saying they want independent Russian assessment of the entity, separate from the joint command structure Whitfield's office already tried and failed to exploit. Saying that if the entity's capability against Fort-class and Destroyer-class Beta is real and repeatable, no single command structure should hold exclusive access to that intelligence, and that Russia has as much right to independent contact as anyone else running this theater. Rusanov's jaw tightened. They asked me, specifically, because I'm the senior Russian officer with direct proximity to the contact site. They didn't order anything yet. They asked whether I'd be willing to open a private channel if the opportunity arose. And what did you tell them? Jinguji asked, already dreading the answer even as she asked it. I told them I'd think about it, Rusanov said, which was a lie to buy time, because I needed to talk to you before I gave them a real answer. Jinguji, I've flown for this front for 3 years, watching command decisions made by people 4,000 kilometers away, who've never once felt what it's like to sit in a cockpit while a Fort-class main gun tracks toward you. I understand the instinct behind wanting independent access. I understand why Moscow doesn't want to be entirely dependent on a joint command structure that just demonstrated, spectacularly, how badly one rogue office can compromise this entire arrangement. He met her eyes. But I also just watched what happens when one faction decides it's entitled to a separate relationship with that thing out there, outside a framework everyone else is supposed to be honoring. I don't think I can, in good conscience, be the second version of what Whitfield already tried to be. Jinguji exhaled slowly, feeling the particular exhaustion of watching a crisis she'd thought was beginning to stabilize reveal an entirely new fracture line underneath it. You did the right thing bringing this to me, instead of just answering them, she said. But I need you to understand, this is bigger than either of us. If Moscow is asking, it's a safe bet other national commands are having the same conversation right now, quietly, through their own channels. Whitfield's office wasn't a single rogue actor. It was a symptom of every command structure in this war independently arriving at the same temptation the moment they realized what that entity is capable of. So what do we do? Rusanov asked. We take it to Chidori Gafuchi, Jinguji said, tonight. Because if this fractures into every national command trying to open its own private channel, we're not looking at one Whitfield anymore. We're looking at a dozen of them. And Kerrigan already told Takamura what happens when a third violation lands after 2. I don't think she cares which flag is on the uniform that breaks her patience the third time. Chidori Gafuchi took the news with the particular grim stillness of a man who had, apparently, been half expecting exactly this development and had simply been hoping he'd have more time before it arrived. I've had 3 separate quiet inquiries over the last week, he admitted, once Jinguji and Rusanov had laid it out. American joint assessment channels, again, despite Whitfield's reassignment. Apparently his successor inherited more of his ambitions than his caution. A European consortium proposal, framed as scientific rather than military, which is the same idea wearing better clothes. And now Moscow, through you, Rusanov, which I appreciate you bringing to me rather than acting on independently. He rubbed his eyes, and for a moment looked considerably older than Jinguji had ever seen him. The uncomfortable truth is that Dr. Kozuki's assessment was correct from the very beginning. We're not dealing with an isolated tactical problem. We're dealing with every national interest represented in this theater simultaneously recognizing the same opportunity and simultaneously convincing itself that its version of exploiting that opportunity would be more careful, more justified, than anyone else's. What's your recommendation? Jinguji asked. I'm going to escalate this above theater command entirely, Chidori Gafuchi said. Full UN Oversight Committee. Joint session. Before this fractures into exactly the scenario you're describing. A dozen quiet channels. each convinced it's the responsible one, each 1 degree of separation from becoming the next Whitfield. I want a single unified framework, binding across every national command in this theater, with real consequences for violation rather than a sideways transfer to Germany. And I want it fast, because I don't believe the entity's patience is going to wait for our committee structure to work at its usual pace. And if the Oversight Committee can't agree fast enough, Rusanov asked, if this takes weeks instead of days. Chidori Gafuchi was quiet for a moment, looking at the tactical display still showing the gray belt's slow, steady green sprawl, the purple-black creep now visible even in daylight satellite passes, no longer confined to a corridor but beginning, subtly, to press outward at its edges, in directions that hadn't been true a week ago. Then I suspect we'll find out exactly how much patience that entity actually has left, he said, before any of us are ready for the answer. That night, Takamura sat alone in the equipment bay, long after the rest of the squadron had gone to quarters, running the same diagnostic on her TSF's shoulder actuator that she'd run a dozen times since this began, and found herself thinking, not for the first time, about the specific weight of the exchange 3 weeks ago, when Kerrigan had first looked at her across 200 meters of freezing dark and pronounced her not beta, the first, smallest acknowledgement that something on the other side of an impossible gap had decided she was worth distinguishing from the enemy it had actually come here to fight. She thought about Matthias, whose locker still bore his name because nobody had found the nerve yet to clear it out. She thought about Whitfield, reassigned rather than held accountable, and about Moscow's quiet inquiry, and the European Consortium's careful scientific framing, and how every single one of those failures traced back to the same root cause. Not malice exactly, but the particular human inability to resist reaching for an advantage the moment one appeared to be within reach, regardless of what the reaching cost the fragile thing holding it back. You're still awake, the voice said, unbidden, inside her skull, and Takamura's hands went still on the diagnostic panel. I didn't call for you, she thought back, more startled than she wanted to admit. You didn't need to, Kerrigan said. I've been listening to the shape of your species' internal argument for 3 days now. Moscow, your Europeans, the ripple from your reassigned officer's old office, still trying to find a quieter door in. I find it useful to listen sometimes, rather than only speaking when spoken to. A pause, cold and considering. I wanted you to know, since you're the one who's been honest with me, that I'm aware of all of it, and that my patience for it is measured in days now, not weeks. Tell your general that, since I suspect he already fears it and simply hasn't had it confirmed. Takamura closed the actuator panel slowly, feeling the particular vertigo of being watched by something that had, apparently, been listening to a crisis unfolding across half a continent's worth of careful, quiet channels, without any of the humans involved ever fully realizing how little privacy their caution actually bought them. I'll tell him, she said aloud, into the empty equipment bay, and somewhere 4 kilometers north, in the deepening cold of an Alaskan night, something vast and patient, and running out of patience all the same, continued its slow, deliberate calculation of exactly how much longer this fragile, divided species deserved the benefit of a doubt it kept failing, one office at a time, to earn. The opportunity, when it arrived, came from an unlikely source, a routine sensor sweep that Petrov almost dismissed before the pattern caught his attention properly. Yuko, I need you to look at this, he said, pulling up 3 days of accumulated data on the rift's structural signature. The aperture isn't stable. It never has been. We've documented fluctuation in its edge geometry since the first night. But look at this periodicity. He overlaid the readings against a clean sine curve, and the correlation was close enough to make Yuko's stomach tighten before he'd even finished explaining it. Every 61 hours, give or take 40 minutes, The rift's structural integrity drops to what I'm estimating is somewhere between 30 and 40% of baseline. It's not random degradation, it's cyclical. Something about maintaining that aperture costs whatever's sustaining it real, periodic effort. You think it's vulnerable during those windows, Yuko said slowly. I think, Petrov said, that if the rift's integrity is genuinely compromised on a predictable cycle, a coordinated strike during that window might be capable of collapsing it entirely, severing whatever connection exists between the entity here and whatever considerably larger thing she told Takamura she answers to only loosely. He looked up, and Yuko could see he understood exactly what he was suggesting, even as he said it. It would isolate her. Whatever forces are already through, we'd still be dealing with, but it would cut off reinforcement, resupply, whatever that connection actually provides her. Permanently. Yuko stared at the data for a long moment, running the implications forward with the same careful rigor she gave every piece of intelligence this war produced, and felt, despite herself, the cold weight of how genuinely tempting the idea was. Get this in front of Chidori Gafuchi, she said finally, today, because if this is real, it's the single most consequential piece of intelligence this crisis has produced, and I don't think any of us are equipped to decide alone what should be done with it. The briefing that followed was the most contentious since the crisis began, and it split the room in ways that didn't track cleanly along the old factional lines Jinguji had grown used to navigating. This is the opening we've been looking for, said Reika, whose position had been the most consistently hawkish since the very first night, and whose support for the idea Jinguji found, this time, unexpectedly difficult to argue against. A window, when the rift itself is vulnerable, potentially permanently severable. If we can cut off whatever's sustaining that connection, we isolate the local swarm from resupply and from whatever command authority is directing strategy from the other side. That's not an act of bad faith against the individual we've been negotiating with. That's ending an existential threat before it grows larger than the one we're already losing to. It's exactly the kind of unilateral strike we've spent 3 weeks insisting we wouldn't take without cause, Jinguji said, surprising herself with how firmly the words came out. We've built whatever fragile trust exists, specifically by choosing honesty and restraint, even when it cost us, even when Matthias died, proving we hadn't fully controlled our own restraint yet. If we strike the rift the moment we find a vulnerability, we're proving every suspicion she's ever voiced about our species' internal divisions. We become the third violation she already warned us she wouldn't distinguish from the others. With respect, Reika said, Colonel, this isn't a violation of the non-interference terms. Those terms cover territory and passage. They say nothing about the rift itself, which predates the agreement and was never explicitly part of it. That's a technicality, Jinguji said, and I don't believe for 1 second that she'll receive it as anything other than exactly that. If we strike the rift, whatever residual trust exists collapses instantly, and we've traded a fragile, workable framework for a guaranteed enemy with a demonstrated capability to level a destroyer-class beta, except now with nothing left to lose by turning that capability fully against us. Chidori Gafuchi, listening to both positions with the particular stillness Jinguji had come to recognize as the sign of a decision genuinely weighing on him rather than one already made, finally spoke. Dr. Kozuki, assess the risk honestly. If we strike and fail to fully sever the connection, what does partial failure look like? Worst case, Yuko said, we damage the rift without closing it, which likely triggers whatever defensive response the entity or whatever's beyond her would mount against a direct attack, at a moment when we've committed forces to the strike and she's had zero warning to prepare a measured response rather than an immediate one. I would not characterize that as a survivable miscalculation for whatever squadron carries it out, and possibly not for this base. And if we succeed fully, Chidori Gafuchi asked, then we've permanently isolated a force that has, twice now, demonstrated capability against the single greatest threat this war has produced, Yuko said. Strategically, that could be the single most significant event of the entire conflict. Morally, she hesitated, and Jinguji watched a woman who had spent 3 years maintaining rigorous professional distance from every horror this war produced, visibly struggle with the weight of the next sentence. Morally, we'd be repaying an entity that has, repeatedly, chosen restraint it didn't owe us, with the exact betrayal it explicitly told us would end its patience permanently. I don't think there's a version of success here that doesn't cost this command something it can't easily name on a strategic assessment sheet. The room went quiet, and Jinguji felt, more clearly than at any point in the 3 weeks since the rift first opened, the actual shape of the choice in front of them. Not a tactical decision at all, in the end, but something closer to a test of what kind of war humanity was actually willing to fight, and what kind of species it was willing to be while fighting it. Takamura, informed of the discovery and the debate surrounding it later that evening, found herself unable to stay silent through the recounting. You're asking whether to betray the one thing in this entire crisis that's actually kept us honest, she said, when Jinguji finished laying out the options. Every time we've told her the truth, even when the truth reflected badly on us, she's extended something closer to good faith than I think any of us expected. Matthias's death didn't collapse this arrangement. The theft didn't collapse it. Both times, she extended patience, specifically because we chose honesty over convenience. If we strike the rift the moment a vulnerability presents itself, we're proving, finally and completely, that every kindness she's extended was wasted on a species that was only ever waiting for its chance. I understand the moral argument, Chidori Gafuchi said quietly. I want you to understand that I'm not dismissing it, but I also have to weigh it against the strategic reality that this war has been unwinnable, by every honest metric, since before either of us was born into it. If there's a genuine chance to permanently remove one of the 2 greatest threats on this front, I cannot in good conscience refuse to consider it purely because doing so would damage a relationship with the entity that constitutes the other threat. Then at least don't decide it in a conference room without her ever having the chance to answer for herself, Takamura said. Let me ask her directly, not to warn her. I understand that defeats the purpose entirely, if this window is real and time-limited. But let me understand, from her, what severing that connection would actually mean before we commit an irreversible act based on Petrov's periodicity calculations and nothing else. I don't think we've earned the right to gamble everything we've built on an assumption when there might be a way to know more first. Chidori Gafuchi considered that for a long moment. You'd be walking a line I'm not sure exists, he said finally. Gathering intelligence without tipping our hand toward action, she'd have every reason to prepare against. I know, Takamura said. I'd rather walk it carefully than not walk it at all. She flew out the following morning, the 61-hour cycle Petrov had identified placing the next vulnerability window some 30 hours out, and found Kerrigan waiting at the settlement's edge, with the particular stillness that had, over 3 weeks, become as familiar to Takamura as any human commander's tells. You're carrying something heavier than usual today, the voice said, before Takamura had spoken a word. Say it. We've built whatever this is on directness. I'd rather you not abandon that now. Takamura chose her words with more care than she'd used in any exchange since first contact. My command has identified a periodic fluctuation in the rift's structural stability, a vulnerability window, roughly every 61 hours. There's an argument being made, right now, that striking during that window could sever whatever connects you to what's beyond it, permanently. The silence that followed was the longest Takamura had ever endured in 3 weeks of contact, long enough that she began to wonder whether she'd just committed the single worst miscalculation of the entire crisis. You're telling me this, Kerrigan said finally, and the thought carried something Takamura had never once heard from her before. Not anger, not cold calculation, but something that read, unmistakably, as genuine surprise. Instead of using it, "I'm asking you what it would actually mean," Takamura said, "before anyone decides whether to act on it. Because I don't think we've earned the right to gamble everything on an assumption when you could simply tell us the truth of what's at stake. And because betraying you the moment we found a vulnerability is exactly the version of my species you've been warning us against becoming. The rift isn't a connection to reinforcement in the way your analysts likely assume," Kerrigan said slowly, as if weighing how much of this was safe to share even now. "It's not a supply line. What's beyond it isn't sending me soldiers. It's closer to a root system. Sever it, and I don't lose resupply. I lose the part of myself that isn't only this local swarm. I become, entirely, only what's standing here, cut off from everything that makes the rest of what I am larger than one queen and her broods." A pause, cold and considering. Whether that makes me weaker or simply smaller depends on questions even I don't have a clean answer to. But it would be permanent, and it would be an act your species undertook the exact moment its restraint stopped costing it anything. Takamura absorbed that in silence, feeling the full weight of what she'd just been trusted with. "I'll relay that faithfully," she said finally. "And I'll tell you honestly, I don't know what my command will decide, but I wanted you to have the chance to be understood before anyone decided anything on your behalf." "That's the choice, isn't it?" Kerrigan said, and for the first time, the thought carried something that sounded, disturbingly, like weariness. Whether you're a species capable of holding power and choosing not to use it the moment it's finally within reach. I've watched entire worlds fail that test before yours. I don't know yet whether yours will be different." The wings shifted, settling. "But I notice you keep giving me reasons to hope it might be. That's more than I expected. 3 weeks ago, from something that still can't decide, collectively, whether I'm worth trusting at all." Takamura carried the answer back to a command room, already tearing itself apart over the decision, and delivered it with the full weight of everything she now understood was actually at stake. Not a tactical calculation at all in the end, but a test of exactly what kind of species humanity intended to be, at the one moment in this entire crisis when the choice to act with restraint would cost them something real, rather than nothing at all. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous, and Jinguji suspected it would never have been unanimous no matter how the argument had gone, because the choice in front of direct command was never really a tactical calculation at all. It was a referendum on what kind of species humanity intended to be, at the one moment restraint would actually cost something. "I want it on record," Rika said, when Chidori Gafuchi finally called for a decision, "that I believe this is a strategic error, the scale of which this war may not survive long enough to regret properly. But I also want it on record that I understand, better than most in this room, what it costs a command to keep faith with something it's afraid of. I've spent 3 weeks arguing for the hard interdiction option. I'll accept being overruled, if that's the decision, and I'll fly whatever mission comes next with the same discipline I'd have given the strike." "Noted and appreciated," Chidori Gafuchi said, and something in his voice carried the particular gravity of a man who understood exactly how much that concession had cost her. He looked around the room. Jinguji, Yuko's feed patched in from the analysis wing, Rusanov standing silent near the back, Takamura seated at the table itself for the first time since this crisis began, her presence a quiet acknowledgement that the decision belonged, in some real sense, as much to the pilot who'd carried every exchange as to the officers arguing policy around her. "We do not strike the rift," Chidori Gafuchi said finally. "Not during this window, not during the next one, not without a change in circumstances considerably more severe than a vulnerability calculation and an untested hypothesis about periodicity. We have built 3 weeks of fragile trust on the specific foundation of choosing honesty over convenience, even when convenience was costly to refuse. I am not willing to be the one who finally proves every fear the entity has voiced about our species was justified, the very first time the cost of restraint became real rather than theoretical. General, Rika said, I've registered my objection. I want to also register, for whatever it's worth, that I hope you're right and I'm wrong. So do I, Chidori Gafuchi said. I have considerably less confidence in that hope than I'd like. Takamura carried the decision back the following morning and delivered it with the same directness that had carried every exchange before it. You chose not to, Kerrigan said, and the thought carried a stillness Takamura had learned, by now, to recognize as something closer to genuine recalibration than mere acknowledgement. Even with the window confirmed, even with the argument, presumably, made in your command's favor by people who understood exactly what severing that connection would buy them. We chose not to, Takamura confirmed. Not because the argument for it was weak, because we decided the kind of species we want to survive as matters more than the advantage we'd have gained by betraying you the first moment it was profitable. There was a long pause, and when the response came, it carried something Takamura had never once heard in 3 weeks of contact. Not warmth exactly, because she suspected warmth in any human sense simply wasn't available to whatever generated these thoughts, but something adjacent to it, a kind of grudging, careful recalculation of a working model that had, until this moment, assumed the worst as the safest default. I've watched this pattern before, Kerrigan said finally. Species finding an advantage and taking it, every time, because the alternative required trusting something that had never given them reason to. I stopped expecting anything else a long time ago. It made surviving simpler. A pause, colder again, though something in the cold had shifted registers. You've made surviving less simple. I don't know yet whether that's a mistake on my part, or the first genuinely useful data point I've gathered about your species in 3 weeks of watching it fail every other test I set for it. Does this change anything? Takamura asked. Practically. The terms, the arrangement. It changes what I'm willing to risk to protect it, Kerrigan said. Which matters, because your hive isn't finished either. It lost a destroyer class, and it's already rebuilding towards something worse. I can feel the shape of what it's assembling from here, and it's not going to be another Vanguard test. It's going to be everything that Hive has left to commit, because hives don't stop escalating just because escalation has cost them twice already. When that comes, I intend to still be standing here to meet it. Whether your species stands with me when it arrives is no longer a question I'm asking out of cold arithmetic alone. The warning proved accurate faster than anyone at Yukon wanted to believe possible. Within 4 days, satellite imaging showed the hive's remaining strategic reserve mobilizing in numbers that dwarfed even the destroyer-class engagement, not merely soldier-class and laser-class formations, but the first confirmed sighting in months of a second Fort-class unit, held in reserve until now, moving in tandem with what Yuko's analysis flagged as a troubling new variant signature nobody in the theater had catalogued before. It's not just numbers this time, Yuko reported at the emergency briefing, voice tight with a fatigue that had become the room's permanent atmosphere over the last month. We're seeing a beta-type variant with elevated ECM emission far above baseline, clustered specifically around the heavier units. My working theory, and I want it flagged as speculative, is that the hive is attempting to jam whatever coordination signal allows the swarm's distributed intelligence to function, the same way it would jam human TSF communications during a coordinated strike. Can it actually affect them? Rusinov asked. Kriska's told us repeatedly, the swarm doesn't register on any conventional sensor band. If their coordination isn't electronic, then the jamming may do nothing at all, Yuko said. Or it may do something we haven't anticipated. because we genuinely don't understand the mechanism well enough to rule it out. What I can tell you with confidence is that the Hive is throwing everything it has left in this sector at a single, decisive push, and it's doing so with a tactical sophistication that would have been unthinkable from this front 3 weeks ago. Whatever else this crisis has cost us, it's taught the Beta how to actually fight an intelligent enemy for the first time in this war's history. I don't think that lesson goes away even after this is over. Chidori Gafuchi absorbed that in the particular stillness of a commander doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Recommendation. We can't stop this from happening, Jinguji said. The scale alone makes interdiction impossible with anything we have in theater. What we can decide is whether the 205th flies pure reconnaissance again, or whether, given everything Takamura has built over the last month, we offer direct support if asked. The room went quiet, and Jinguji felt, for the first time since the crisis began, the actual weight of a decision that wasn't going to be resolved by careful diplomatic language or committee argument, but by whether humanity was prepared to fight, openly and directly, alongside something it had spent 3 weeks deciding, one honest exchange at a time, might actually be worth standing beside. Chidori Gafuchi's answer came after a silence long enough that Jinguji began to understand, watching his face, that he'd already known what he was going to say before he'd finished asking the room for input. He'd simply needed to hear the weight of the question spoken aloud before committing to it. If Takamura is asked for direct support, he said, she flies it. Not as sanctioned military alliance. I am not prepared to put that language in front of the UN Oversight Committee and ask them to ratify a formal partnership with an entity none of us fully understand, but as tactical judgment, exercised in the field, by the officer who has earned more insight into this situation than anyone else in this command. If she believes standing beside that entity in this fight serves this base's survival and this war's actual chances, I will not stand in her way with a paperwork objection while the front burns. General, Rika said, and for once there was no argument in her voice at all, only the flat exhaustion of someone who had spent a month fighting a position she no longer fully believed in. I withdraw my earlier objections, not because I think this is safe, because I think Takamura has been right more often than the rest of us over the last month, and I'd rather trust that track record than my own instincts at this point. The Hive's final push came at dawn, 3 days later, under a sky the color of old bruises, and it did not look like any engagement Takamura had flown in 3 years of war. The formation stretched across the entire visible width of the gray belt corridor, soldier class in numbers that made her sensor display simply stop attempting individual unit counts past a certain density. Laser class interspersed with the deliberate saturation pattern the previous engagement had taught the Hive to favor. The second fort class held its center mass like an anchor the rest of the formation oriented around. And behind all of it, moving with the particular unhurried inevitability of something that had learned, finally and completely, not to waste its heaviest asset early, a presence Yuko's analysts had spent 2 days confirming with mounting dread. A second destroyer class, the first ever recorded operating in tandem with another unit of its own type on this front. Command, I have visual on the full committed force, Takamura reported, holding her TSF at the settlement's edge, watching the swarm's own forces arraying to meet it with a coordination that carried, this time, none of the confident ease of the first 2 engagements, something tighter, more deliberate. The visible signature of something that understood, finally, that this fight would cost more than either of the ones before it. This is everything the Hive has left in this sector. If this fails, I don't believe it has anything else to send. Then it doesn't fail, Kerrigan's voice said inside her skull, flat and certain in a way that Takamura had learned, over a month of contact, to read as genuine confidence rather than performance. I asked you a question 3 days ago, Takamura, about whether your species stood with me when this came. I'm asking it again, now, Because it's here. I'm here, Takamura said. Tell me what would actually help. The pause that followed carried a different quality than any before it. Not calculation exactly, but something closer to genuine consideration of a resource she hadn't expected to have available. The ECM variant your hive is fielding is attempting to disrupt the coordination signal my broods use to function as a single force, Kerrigan said. It isn't working the way the hive intends. My coordination isn't electronic. It never has been. But the emission is degrading something adjacent. Some kind of sensory interference I don't have a clean model for yet. And it's slowing my brood's reaction time by a margin that matters against something moving as fast as a second destroyer class. If your TSFs can suppress those ECM-emitting units specifically, even briefly, it removes an interference I can't remove myself without diverting attention from the larger threat. Command, I have a specific, actionable request, Takamura relayed immediately. Target priority on ECM variant units. Concentrated support fire to suppress their emission specifically. This isn't combat support for the swarm broadly. It's a precision request that plays to what our own systems are actually built to do. Chidori Gafuchi's response came without hesitation this time. The earlier agonizing deliberation apparently spent entirely on the decision to allow this moment to happen at all, leaving nothing but clear-eyed commitment once it had arrived. 205 TH. You are cleared for direct engagement against confirmed ECM variant beta units. Full squadron scramble. Rusanov has tactical lead on the human engagement. Takamura maintains coordination liaison with the entity. Go. What followed was unlike any battle Takamura had flown, not because the violence itself was unprecedented. She had seen worse density of fire in engagements that mattered considerably less. But because for the first time in this entire crisis, human TSFs and swarm creatures moved across the same battlefield with something that resembled, however uneasily, actual coordination rather than parallel, separate wars being fought over the same disputed ground. Rusanov took the 205th in a tight diving pass along the formation's northern flank. Cannon fire concentrated with brutal precision on the cluster of ECM variant units Yuko's analysis had flagged, and Takamura watched. Even through the chaos, the visible effect ripple outward through the swarm's reaction time the moment the first units went down. Creatures that had been moving with a half-second's hesitation, suddenly snapping back to the fluid. Terrible efficiency of the earliest engagements, and Kerrigan herself, freed of whatever interference had been dragging at her perception, turned to meet the advancing second destroyer class with a speed that made the first fight against its counterpart look almost cautious by comparison. ECM suppression confirmed effective, Kriska reported, voice tight with concentration as she fed targeting data through the Esper link to Inia's fire control. Swarm reaction times are recovering across the entire engaged front. Command, this is working. The battle that followed cost both sides more than either of the two before it. Takamura watched 3 separate swarm creature clusters annihilated outright by concentrated laser class saturation before the 205th suppression runs could reach them. Watched Michael's TSF take a glancing hit from the second Fort class that sent his frame spinning before Rusanov's covering fire bought him room to recover. Watched the ground itself churn into something that no longer resembled any recognizable terrain at all, simply a shifting mass of violence stretching from horizon to horizon under a bruised, indifferent sky. And at its center, Kerrigan met the second destroyer class with a fury that carried none of the careful, testing calculation of the first engagement. She had learned this opponent's shape already, understood exactly which strikes cost it most, and the fight that followed lasted barely 6 minutes before the massive unit staggered, blinded across every sensor cluster Takamura's earlier battle had taught her to target, and came apart under a final, concentrated strike that lit the whole battlefield violet-white for one blinding instant. The second fort class fell 4 minutes later, caught between the swarm's renewed offensive and a final, devastating strafing run from the 205th that Rusanov led personally. And when the dust and smoke finally began to clear across the ruined stretch of the Grey Belt, what remained of the Hive's committed force was in full, uncoordinated retreat. Not a fighting withdrawal, not a tactical repositioning, but something that read, on every sensor still functioning across the battlefield, as the closest thing to genuine collapse this Hive had shown in 3 years of war. The silence that followed the battle was the strangest thing Takamura had experienced in the entire month-long crisis. Not the tense, wary quiet of the standoffs that had characterized every previous encounter, but something closer to shared, exhausted stillness. Human TSFs and swarm creatures alike, holding position across a ruined battlefield that neither side seemed quite ready to claim as victory, rather than simply survival. Kerrigan found her at the field's edge, wings torn in 4 places now, one leg dragging visibly, and yet standing, always standing, with the particular stubborn refusal to fall that Takamura had come, over the last month, to associate with something she was no longer entirely comfortable calling merely an enemy. "That Hive won't reconstitute a threat of this scale again," Kerrigan said, and the thought carried an exhaustion Takamura hadn't heard from her before. Not weakness exactly, but the honest cost of something that had spent everything it had to win. Not soon, possibly not ever, in this sector. It threw its last reserve at us and lost it entirely. "You did that," Takamura said. "We helped, but you carried the weight of it." "We did it," Kerrigan corrected. And the distinction, this time, carried a weight entirely different from every earlier correction she'd made. Not the cold clarification of separate arithmetic, but something that sounded, unmistakably, like an admission she hadn't expected to make. "I've fought 100 worlds worth of desperate, doomed defenders before yours, Takamura. Most of them never earned anything from me beyond whatever use I found for their ground. Yours has earned something else. I don't have a clean word for it in whatever language your species built for feelings this complicated. But I know the difference between a species I'd have abandoned to its own hive weeks ago and one I just fought beside because I wanted to, not merely because the arithmetic demanded it." Above them, in the bruised morning sky, the rift continued its slow, patient pulse, and Takamura, watching it, understood with sudden clarity that whatever came next in this war, whatever the Hive rebuilt, whatever larger thing waited on the other side of that tear in the world, whatever her own species' fractured, imperfect command structure still had left to prove about itself, the answer to Kerrigan's oldest and coldest question had, somewhere across a month of hard-won honesty, quietly and irreversibly changed. The weeks that followed the Hive's collapse settled into something Jinguji found herself, with real caution, willing to call peace. Not the absence of danger, because the front never offered that, but the particular quiet of a war that had, for the moment, stopped actively trying to kill everyone in it at once. Direct Command's Oversight Committee finally produced its unified framework 11 days after the battle, a document considerably more careful than anything Whitfield's charter had ever permitted, binding across every national command, with real consequence attached to violation, this time, rather than a sideways transfer to a research annex. Jinguji read it twice, found it imperfect in the particular way every negotiated document was imperfect, and signed her portion of it with something closer to hope than she'd allowed herself in a month. Rusanov cleared Matthias's locker himself. 3 weeks after the funeral, nobody at Yukon had wanted to hold and everybody had needed to, and said nothing about it to anyone, though Takamura noticed the small photograph he kept afterward, tucked into his own kit rather than discarded, of a pilot who died reaching for an advantage that had never been his to reach for. Yuko's research into the swarm's biology continued, carefully, transparently. Every sample and observation logged with an openness that Kerrigan herself had, unexpectedly, begun permitting. Not full access, never that, but enough that the working relationship between researcher and reluctant subject had settled into something neither adversarial nor entirely comfortable. A truce built on the same hard-won honesty that had carried everything else this crisis produced. And Takamura kept flying, kept meeting Kerrigan at the settlement's edge in the gray Alaskan mornings, kept carrying exchanges that had stopped, somewhere in the last month, being negotiations at all and become something closer to two exhausted survivors, comparing notes on a war neither of them had chosen, but both of them intended to keep fighting. "You could have let the hive win," Takamura said, one morning some 3 weeks after the battle, watching Kerrigan oversee the slow, methodical work of consolidating what remained of her settlement's damaged perimeter, before we ever offered support. "You could have decided this world's hive was too costly a fight and moved on to easier ground somewhere else on this planet." "I could have," Kerrigan agreed. "I've done exactly that before, on other worlds, when the cost of holding ground outweighed what the ground was worth. I didn't, here, and I've spent some time since trying to understand why, because I don't extend effort I can't account for." The wings settled, and something in the stillness that followed carried, unmistakably, the particular weight of an answer she hadn't expected to have to give. "I think it's because your species kept insisting on being complicated in ways I hadn't accounted for. Every time I expected betrayal, I got honesty instead, delivered by people who understood exactly what honesty was going to cost them, and chose it anyway. That's rarer than you'd think, across every world I've ever measured against yours." "Does that change what happens next?" Takamura asked. "Between your people and mine, once this front settles, once the immediate threat isn't forcing either of us to need the other?" "I don't know yet," Kerrigan said, and the admission carried none of the cold, guarded calculation of the earliest exchanges, only something that sounded, finally, like genuine uncertainty extended, without fear of what the honesty cost. "I've never once had to answer that question before, because no world I've ever fought beside has survived long enough, or proven itself worth the effort, to make the question matter. Yours might, I find, against every instinct built across every previous war I've fought, that I'd like to find out." Takamura held the exchange in silence for a long moment, watching the pale gray Alaskan dawn spread slowly across a battlefield that had, somehow, over the course of a month neither of them had chosen, become something neither entirely enemy nor entirely ally, simply two exhausted, wary survivors from two impossibly different worlds who had learned, the hard way, exactly what it cost to keep choosing honesty over the easier lie, and had decided, each in their own cold or human way, that the cost was worth paying. "I'd like that too," she said finally, and meant it. Above them, in the slowly brightening sky, the rift continued its patient, steady pulse, no longer a wound torn suddenly into the world, but something closer now, to a fixed and permanent feature of a war that had grown one impossible variable stranger, and against every reasonable expectation either side had carried into that first freezing night, 1 degree less lonely. The Beta War was not over. It would not be over for a long time yet, and everyone standing on that ruined ground understood as much. The hive would rebuild. Elsewhere, if not here, other fronts across a dying world would keep grinding down the fragile, desperate defenses humanity had built against an extinction it had been quietly losing to for years. But for the first time since Yui Takamura had watched a Fort-class Beta fall to something that shouldn't have existed on this front at all, the war felt, if only slightly, if only in this one contested corner of a frozen and burning world, like something that might yet be survived, not through the arrival of an unstoppable weapon that solved everything by force alone, but through the harder, rarer thing that had actually held this fragile arrangement together. two species, neither one able to fully trust the other, choosing again and again, at real cost. To be honest anyway, it was not a happy ending. Wars this large rarely offered one. But it was, Takamura thought, watching Kerrigan turn back toward the slow work of rebuilding what the last battle had cost her. Something considerably better than the alternative. A beginning, fragile and uncertain, and entirely unearned by anything, except the accumulated weight of hard choices made honestly, one impossible morning at a time.